He had ruled half a continent and never once knelt. Not for storm, not for steel, not for any god carved into stone or whispered through smoke. Vaelor Draven built his empire on one truth: the weak get swallowed, the strong set the terms. 34 years of iron will, and he had never found a single thing in this world that could crack him open. Then the storm brought her. Broken, bleeding, burning in silver scars, she was nothing but a dying girl in the mud. And the moment his hand touched hers, something ancient inside him, something he had spent a lifetime burying, tore itself wide awake. Drop your city below. Stay until the end. You need to see what happens to a king who thought he was already whole. The storm came off the western sea like something with a grudge. It hit the cliffs of Dravenmoor first, the way bad things always did. Without warning, without ceremony, just the sudden wall of black cloud swallowing the last pale strip of evening sky, and then the wind following behind it like a fist. Rain came next, not the soft inland kind, but the coastal assault, driving horizontal, full of salt and cold, the kind that found the gaps between armor plates and punched through them. Vaelor Draven sat his horse in the middle of the royal road and did not move. Behind him, 14 carriages had ground to a halt. The escort, 60 riders in black plate, the obsidian crown stamped into every pauldron, had bunched up at his back, horses stamping and blowing, none of them willing to speak first. His personal guard commander, Ren Colvis, had edged forward until his mount was near shoulder to shoulder with the king's stallion. Ren had served 12 years. He knew better than to speak without invitation. He did it anyway. "My king." Ren's voice was flat, designed to carry nothing. "The coastal fortress is 3 miles out. We pushed through this. We're under roof before—" "Stop talking." Ren stopped. Vaelor didn't look at him. He was staring down the road, which had gone from packed earth to sucking mud somewhere in the last quarter mile, and the storm had already swallowed it 50 yards ahead. He couldn't see the cliff edge from here, but he knew it was close. He knew these roads. He had ridden every road in this empire at some point, usually in worse conditions than this, usually with more enemies at his back. That wasn't what had stopped him. Something had pulled, deep inside his chest, below the ribcage, below anything a man could name cleanly. A sensation like a hook set in bone, tugging. His wolf had gone from the restless background noise it always made to something sharp and urgent, a full-body attention that he hadn't felt since the last battle, since the moment before the ambush when his instincts had yanked him sideways and the crossbow bolt had passed through the space where his throat had been. That kind of attention kept you alive. He trusted it completely. "Lights," he said. "My king." Torches. 6 men, spread left off the road toward the cliffs. Now. There was a pause. The pause of someone calculating whether the order made sense. And then Ren's voice behind him snapping the command to the escort. Vaelor heard the riders moving, heard torch flint striking twice before flame caught, saw the orange glow blooming in his peripheral vision as 6 of his men pushed their horses off the road and into the scrub and stone that led toward the cliff edge. He followed. The ground here was brutal, loose shale under the topsoil, exposed in patches where the rain had already stripped the surface, his stallion picking its way with the careful tension of an animal that knew one wrong step ended everything. Vaelor kept his weight balanced and his attention on the pull inside his chest, which was stronger now, directional, northwest, toward where the cliffs bent outward in a long promontory above a 200-foot drop. "What are we looking for?" one of the riders asked, and Ren said nothing, and neither did Vaelor. He found her 20 yards from the edge. She was barely moving. Face down in the mud, one arm extended ahead of her as though she had been trying to crawl somewhere when her body finally gave out. The other arm folded beneath her, soaked through, hair plastered black against the back of her neck and shoulders. Thin, visibly, dangerously thin, even through the torn rags she wore, which might once have been a dress, or might once have been a grain sack. It was impossible to tell anymore. Vaelor stepped down from his horse before anyone else had processed what they were looking at. "My king!" He was already crouching beside her. Up close, the rain couldn't wash away what had been done to her. The burn marks ran up both forearms and disappeared under her sleeves. Silver burns, the specific kind that left raised welts and that particular gray-white scar tissue. Someone had put silver directly against her skin, repeatedly, The pattern of it wasn't random. This wasn't accident or battle. This was systematic. This was someone with time and intention. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Her pulse was there, weak and threadbare, skipping beats in a way that meant blood loss or shock or both. But there, her skin was ice. "Stretcher," he said. "My king, we don't know who she—" "Stretcher, a healer from the convoy. You have 60 seconds before I start removing rank from people." He heard scrambling. He stayed where he was, crouched in the mud beside her, and he did the thing he almost never permitted himself. He let his wolf instincts fully surface for a moment, let them read what his human senses couldn't. The pull had become something else now, something that had no name in the language he used to run an empire, something older than language entirely. His wolf knew her. That wasn't possible. He had never seen this woman in his life. He reached out and pushed the hair away from the back of her neck, and the torchlight caught the mark there, carved directly into the skin, not tattooed, carved, the raised keloid lines of a branding done with a heated blade, and he recognized it. Every lord in the western reaches recognized it. The Bloodfang sigil, the mark the Bloodfang King put on the people he claimed as property. Something went very quiet inside Vaelor Draven. Not the kind of quiet that precedes retreat, the kind that precedes total commitment to a course of action that cannot be walked back. He stood up. Ren was there with the stretcher bearers and the convoy healer, an older woman named Sora, who had survived 3 battlefield campaigns in Vaelor's service, was pushing through behind them, her kit already open in her hands despite the rain. Vaelor stepped back and let them work, watching Sora's face as the healer knelt and began her assessment. He watched her hands slow when she found the burns, watched her jaw tighten when she turned the woman's arm and saw the full extent of the silver scarring, watched her go very still when she moved the hair and saw the branding. Sora looked up at him. "She's alive," Sora said, "but not by much. If she'd been out here another 2 hours—" She stopped, started again. "I need warm shelter and proper light, and about 6 things from the surgical kit I didn't bring on a road journey because I wasn't expecting surgery on a road journey. The coastal fortress has everything you need. Then we move her now, and we move her carefully. She's got at least 1 broken rib, and I won't know the rest until I can—" "Do what you have to do," Vaelor said. "Keep her alive." Sora held his gaze for a beat, which most people didn't dare, and then she nodded and turned back to her patient. Vaelor walked back to his horse and mounted. Ren fell in beside him. "The Bloodfang mark," Ren said quietly. Not a question. "You saw it." "I saw it." A pause that the rain hadn't let up. "This could be a plant. A trap. Someone who knows the king's convoy route drops a woman in the road with that mark, and—" "Could be," Vaelor said. "You're still taking her in." "Yes." Ren was quiet for a moment. "Permission to speak plainly. You've been doing it for 12 years. I stopped giving permission around year 3. She could be anyone. Bloodfang slave who escaped, Bloodfang spy who was burned as punishment for failing, a political tool that 4 different interested parties could be moving right now. We don't know." "We don't," Vaelor agreed. "Then why—" "Because I said keep her alive," Vaelor said, and the tone of it closed the conversation like a door slamming. And Ren, who had survived 12 years by being very good at reading which doors not to open again, said nothing more. They moved. The coastal fortress of Morn wasn't a comfortable place. It had been built for function, the way everything in the Obsidian Crown territories had been built. Thick walls, narrow windows, defensible approaches, dungeons that hadn't been empty in the 30 years since Vaelor's father had first taken the Western territories by force. It smelled of salt and old stone and the particular staleness of a garrison building, full of soldiers who ate and slept and sharpened their weapons and waited for the next war. Vaelor had given the woman the only room in the fortress with a proper hearth. That had caused its own wave of carefully suppressed reaction among the garrison. He had seen it in the faces, the glances exchanged, the calculations happening behind eyes trained to show nothing. The king's room. Given to an unknown woman pulled half dead from a cliff road. No explanation offered, no explanation expected. He sat now in the adjoining chamber, boots off, jacket open, with a cup of something hot that he hadn't touched since they brought it to him 2 hours ago. Through the wall he could hear Sora working, the murmur of instructions to her assistants, the occasional sharp word when something went wrong, the long silences that meant concentration. The pull was still there, quieter now that she was close, less like urgency, more like a compass needle that had found its direction and had simply settled. He didn't like any of this. Vaelor Draven had built his life, his empire, his power, every decision of consequence he had ever made, on the bedrock of control, not cruelty. He had never been especially cruel for its own sake, but control. The certainty that what moved him to act was reason, strategy, the long calculation of what benefited the empire and therefore benefited the people inside it. He had walked away from things that could have destroyed his concentration, had walked away from people. He had made peace with the understanding that the wolf bond, the mate bond, the thing the elder wolves talked about in hushed tones like it was a gift from the old world, was something that happened to other wolves, not to kings who couldn't afford the liability. He had been wrong about that, apparently. The door opened and Sora came through. She was wiping her hands on a cloth that had seen better days, and her expression was the kind that delivered news without performing it. "She'll live," Sora said. 3 broken ribs, not 4. I miscounted in the field. Silver burns on both arms, both shoulders, and a section of her upper back that tells me someone used a silver-edged implement on her more than once over a period of time. Those wounds are different ages. The branding on her neck was recent. 2 weeks, maybe 3. She set down her cloth. She's malnourished. Not the kind you get from a week without eating, the kind you get from months of insufficient food. She's strong, under everything. Muscle memory of someone who was once in much better condition, but she's been kept in a state of deliberate weakness for a long time. Every word landed like a stone dropped into standing water. When will she wake? Tomorrow morning, if the fever breaks tonight. If it doesn't, Sora paused. I'd rather plan for it breaking. She's fighter. Even unconscious, there's something in how her body's responding that reads as, I don't have a better word than stubborn. Like she hasn't decided yet whether to give up and is leaning against it. She won't give up, Vaelor said, and then heard himself say it and set that aside to examine later. Sora studied him with the direct attention of a woman who had seen him in extremis enough times to know the difference between his moods. The blood test, she said carefully. What about it? I took a standard sample for the injury assessment. Standard practice, you know that. And my king, I need to tell you what I found before I write it down, because once it's written, tell me. Sora's hands had gone still. The markers. The blood lineage indicators that... She stopped. Started again. I've only seen those markers twice in my career. Once in an old textbook, studying historical pathology of the royal bloodlines. Once in person, when I served briefly in the southern courts before your campaigns. She met his eyes. The Celestine markers, my king, both chromosomal indicators, clean and unmistakable. The room was very quiet. The Celestine royal line was exterminated, Vaelor said. His voice came out level. He was aware of making it level. 8 years ago, the massacre at Vael's Crossing, the entire royal family of the Celestine Kingdom. My intelligence has confirmed it multiple times. Your intelligence confirmed the bodies of the main family line, Sora said. There was a daughter, the youngest, never formally presented at court because she was considered too young for political exposure. The records I've seen place her at 13 at the time of the massacre. She would be 21 now, 21, which matched the woman in the next room, which matched the build of someone who had been 13 when their life had been ripped apart and had spent the following 8 years in whatever condition produced the damage Sora had just catalogued. If this reaches the wrong ears before you've decided what to do with it, Sora said, there are 17 different political factions inside this empire and outside it who would want her dead before dawn. I know. So I am asking, my king, formally, as your healer, as someone who has served you a long time, what do you want me to do with this information? Vaelor stood. He moved to the window. The storm had softened to a steady, hard rain, the worst of it blown through, and he could see the cliff edge from here, a dark, irregular line against the slightly lighter dark of the sea below. You remember it, he said. You don't write it. Not yet. And her? She's under my protection. That will generate questions. Let it generate questions, Vaelor said. I'm used to people asking questions I don't answer. Sora picked up her cloth in her bag. At the door she paused. She said something, before she went fully under. I don't know if it means anything. He waited. She said, Don't let them give me back. Sora's voice was even, professional. Don't let them give me back to him. She left. Vaelor stood at the window for a long time. She woke before dawn. He heard it, heard the shift of her breathing through the wall, the small, sharp sound of someone surfacing from unconsciousness into pain and not knowing where they were, the kind of sound that preceded panic. He was through the connecting door before the sound had fully finished, and he told himself later, when he examined his own actions with the cold eye he applied to everything else, that it was strategic, that a panicked patient ran risks of reopening wounds, that keeping her calm served practical purposes. He stood just inside the doorway and said, You're safe. She had gotten herself upright. Not fully. One arm braced against the headboard, the other pressed against her ribs, face twisted with the pain of the broken bones, but upright enough that she could see the room. She was looking at him with eyes that were dark, very dark, and sharp despite everything, the kind of eyes that had spent a long time cataloging exits and threats and relative distances before deciding anything else. She didn't say anything. My name is Vaelor Draven, he said. You're in the coastal fortress of Morn. You were found on the cliff road north of here during the storm. My healer has attended to your injuries. You have broken ribs and burns that are being treated. You are not a prisoner. Her eyes moved around the room, to the door, to the window, to the fire, back to him. Then I can leave, she said. Her voice was rough. Disuse and dehydration and probably a throat scraped raw by rain, but it was direct. No trembling, no performance of weakness. She said it as a test, not as a plea. You can try, Vaelor said. With 3 broken ribs and a fever that broke 4 hours ago, you'd make it approximately to the first corridor before you fell down. Then my guards would carry you back here, which would be undignified for both of us. A silence. Something moved behind her eyes, not softening exactly. Recalculation. Vaelor Draven, she said. The Obsidian King. Yes. You're a long way from your throne room. I travel. Kings don't travel without purpose. Her chin came up slightly, and he could see the effort that small movement cost her. What do you want from me? At the moment, for you to lie back down before you fall sideways and undo 4 hours of my healer's work. That's not an answer. No, he said. It isn't. Another silence. She held his gaze with the focused intensity of someone who had learned to read faces as a survival mechanism, reading for the lie beneath the surface, the intention that the words were covering. He let her look. He had nothing to hide at the moment, which was a rare enough condition that he didn't feel the need to interfere with it. Elyria, she said finally. My name is Elyria Vael. Elyria. He kept his face neutral with the ease of long practice. Not the name she had been born with, he was now certain. A name she had built herself, or been given in captivity, or had chosen when her original name became too dangerous to carry. But it was what she had offered, and he would take it. Are you in pain? Yes. On a scale that requires more treatment tonight, or a scale that can wait for morning. She thought about it, actually considered it, which meant she was capable of honest self-assessment even now, which told him something. Morning, she said. Then lie down. You're very comfortable giving orders. Occupational habit. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, too close to bone, too far from ease for that, but the ghost of one, the memory of what smiling felt like, briefly surfacing before her face closed it back down. She lay back with the careful, controlled movement of someone managing pain, and Vaelor crossed to the chair by the fire and sat. She looked at him. You're staying? Yes. Why? He thought about several answers and chose the one that was true. Because I have questions that can wait until morning, and I want to be here when you're ready to answer them. And if I'm never ready, Then I'll sit here a long time. She turned her head toward the fire. He watched her from the chair, the way her breathing leveled out as the pain medication did its work, the way her hands slowly uncurled from the fists they had been since she woke, the way sleep dragged at her despite every instinct she had to stay awake and alert. She fought it. He could see her fighting it, see the moment-by-moment decision to stay conscious, to keep her eyes on the room. She lost the fight around the time the fire burned low. Her eyes closed, her breathing evened, and she slept. Vaelor stayed in the chair. He had run an empire for 11 years. He had made decisions that killed people and saved people, and restructured the lives of hundreds of thousands in ways they would never directly trace back to a single man in a dark room. He had never once second-guessed a decision after it was made. The making was where the doubt lived. After the decision, you committed and you moved. He looked at the branding on her neck. Even in firelight, in sleep, her face angled away from him. It was visible. The deliberate cruelty of it. The statement it made in the Bloodfang King's language. This is mine. This is marked, and the mark is permanent. His wolf had opinions about that. He kept them leashed. For now. She was sitting up when he woke in the chair at first light, already watching him, and that was the thing. She had clearly been awake long enough to observe him sleeping, and she had made no move toward the door, made no sound, just waited, watching. You stayed, she said. I said I would. A pause. Her face was clear in the morning light, the fever flush gone. He could see the structure of it properly now. High bones. Dark hollows beneath, from too long without enough food. Eyes that were brown at some angles and almost amber at others, and a steadiness in them that didn't match the wreckage of everything else. You want to know about the mark, she said. Among other things. She touched her neck, not unconsciously, deliberately, the way you touch a wound to confirm it's still there. The Bloodfang King's mark. I'm sure you know what it means. I know what it means. Then you know what I was. Past tense, Vaelor said. You were, not are. Something tightened across her face. Not gratitude, exactly. Something closer to the wariness of someone who had been offered kindness before and found a price attached. You're very certain about that for someone who found me in a ditch 8 hours ago. I'm certain about most things. That must be convenient. It has its uses. He leaned forward in the chair. Elyria, I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to think I'm either lying or deranged, and I'm asking you to sit with it before you react. Can you do that? Her jaw set. Say what you're going to say. I found you because I couldn't not find you. He watched her face. Every wolf knows the bond in theory. Most go their whole lives without feeling it. I had assumed I was one of those. He paused. The words were stark, undecorated. He wasn't a man who decorated things. I was wrong. Whatever pulled me off that road last night was not a decision I made. It was something older than decisions. The silence stretched. Outside, he could hear the fortress beginning to wake. Footsteps, distant voices, the changing of the guard. You're telling me... She started. Yes. That's not... She stopped, started again. I've been property for 8 years. I've been... Her voice cut off. When it came back, it was stripped down to the frame. You don't know what you're claiming. No, he agreed. Not yet. Neither do you, but I know what I felt, and I know what my wolf recognizes, and I know that neither of those things have ever misfired before. A beat. I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm asking you to stay alive long enough that we both have time to figure out what it means. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see the calculus happening, the threat assessment, the game theory of choices, the evaluation of which risks were tolerable and which weren't. My healer will need to check your dressings, he said. After that, if you're strong enough, I'd like to have a longer conversation. There are things I need to understand about your history, and there are things... He stopped. Things what? Things I think you may need to understand about mine, he said. About this empire. About what may have been done here, in my name, while I was occupied with other parts of it. Her eyes sharpened. What things? After you've eaten, he said. After Sora has looked at you. You're going to need strength for this conversation, Elyria, and I'd rather you have it. She held his gaze. You already know something, she said quietly. You already have a piece of it. He didn't deny it. Then tell me, she said, and her voice had gone flat and cold in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with someone who had spent years hoarding every fragment of information about the forces that had destroyed her life. Tell me what you know. All of it, right now. I've waited 8 years for someone in a position of power to sit across from me and tell me the truth. I can eat after. He looked at her. This woman made of scar tissue and survival instinct, with a Bloodfang brand on her neck and blood that matched a dead royal line and eyes that had been sharpened on years of people who wanted her broken. He reached a decision. 3 nights ago, he said, my intelligence officer delivered a report that included documents recovered from a raid on a Bloodfang supply convoy. One of those documents was a transaction record. He watched her face. It detailed the sale of a prisoner. A specific prisoner. The notation on the prisoner's record indicated she had been delivered by an intermediary to the Bloodfang King 8 years ago in exchange for territorial concessions in the north and a sealed debt agreement. He paused. The intermediary was identified by name. She had gone absolutely still. The name on that document, Vaelor said, and his voice was very even now, the kind of even that meant something underneath it was anything but, was Lord Vaelor Draven. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the sea was gray and flat in the early light. Your uncle, Elyria said. My uncle, Vaelor said. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry and bright and burning. There's more, she said. Not a question. Yes. Tell me the rest. There's a ledger, he said. A royal accounting ledger in a location I've only recently become aware of, far north in the ruins at... A sound from the corridor. Not a guard's footstep. Something wrong in the rhythm of it, wrong in the gap of silence that followed. Vaelor was on his feet before he had consciously processed it, his hand already on the blade at his hip, turning toward the door. The door did not open. Instead, the wall to the left of it, the outer wall, the one that faced the sea, exploded inward. What? The blast took out a 6-foot section of stone and threw Vaelor sideways into the chair hard enough to crack the arm off it, a ringing whiteout filling his head for 2 seconds that felt like 2 years, and when his vision cleared there were shapes coming through the dust and rubble, not soldiers, not his guards, but men in unmarked dark clothing, faces covered, moving with the trained economy of contract killers who had done this before. 4 of them. Through the wall. He counted and moved simultaneously. The first man reached him before he was fully upright and paid for it in the 2 seconds of time it took Vaelor to drive an elbow into the man's throat and use his dropping weight as leverage to get his feet under him. The blade was out now. The second man came in fast, and he turned it into a grapple because the range was too close for the blade to be useful, and they went into the remains of the wall together, granite dust and crumbled mortar, and the sea wind coming through the gap cold as a blade of its own. Behind him he could hear Elyria. He could hear her moving, and he could hear, underneath the fighting, underneath the immediate physical problem of the third man now flanking him, the sound of someone doing something he hadn't expected. Not screaming, not freezing, not retreating to the bed. He drove his knife into the third man and got free enough to see her. She had the water pitcher from the bedside table in her grip, the heavy ceramic one, iron handle, and she had just put it into the fourth man's face with enough force that he was currently not standing. She was breathing in sharp, controlled pulls, one arm folded against her broken ribs, and her eyes were up and sweeping the room for the next threat. The fourth man on the floor was not getting up. His 3 were also down. The room was very quiet. Vaelor looked at her. She looked at him, blood on her knuckles from the pitcher's edge. Her face was white with pain and something else. Something lit from the inside, electric, like a current running just below the skin. Water pitcher, he said. It was within reach, she said. From the corridor came the sound of his guards finally responding. Boots, shouting, the door being hit from outside by people who had secured the other side of it. Vaelor crossed to the gap in the wall, looked at the sea below, the cliff face, looked at the rope that had been secured to the gap's edge, a rope that ran down the cliff face and up the cliff face, and that connected at the far end to a second boat that was already pulling away from the rocks. A support team. An extraction for when the 4 men had finished. The rope had a secondary line on it, and the secondary line had a leather message tube. He cut it free, opened it. The note inside was 12 words, written in a hand he recognized. He read it once, read it again. Ren hit the door and it gave, and 6 of his guard flooded the room, assessed, and went professional. Securing the 4 bodies, checking the gap in the wall, moving to positions. Ren stopped beside him. "My king, what?" Vaelor handed him the note. Ren read it. His face went flat in the specific way it went flat when something was very wrong. "This is his handwriting," Ren said quietly. "Lord Maelor's." "Yes." The note read, "She remembers too much. The ledger exists. If she reaches it before I do, your throne is the first thing she burns. The girl dies tonight, or we all answer for it." In the room, Elyria had lowered herself carefully back to the edge of the bed. She was watching him from across the rubble and the bodies of the men who had been sent to kill her in the king's own fortress, with 4 walls around her that had not been enough, and a face that had moved past shock into something that looked very much like a person who had been waiting their entire life to stop running. "What does it say?" she asked. Vaelor folded the note. He looked at the woman who carried a dead kingdom in her blood, who had survived 8 years of systematic destruction, who had put a water pitcher into an assassin's face with 3 broken ribs. And he felt the mate bond settle into him like it had always been there, like the chain it was, the one he had not chosen and would not now undo. "It says," he told her, "that we're out of time." Ren was still holding the note when Vaelor moved, not toward the gap in the wall, not toward the door, toward Elyria, crossing the rubble in 4 strides and crouching in front of her at the bed's edge, putting himself at her eye level because he needed to see her face when he asked this and he needed her to see his. "The ledger," he said. "What do you know about it?" She looked at him. The amber in her eyes had gone dark, the way water goes dark before a storm breaks the surface. "How do you know about the ledger?" "My intelligence recovered documents. 3 nights ago? Bloodfang supply convoy." He watched her process that. "The ledger was referenced, not described. Location wasn't given. My uncle's name was in the same documents. What I need to know right now is whether you knew about the ledger before tonight, and if you did, what's in it." The guards were working around them, Ren issuing quiet orders behind Vaelor's back. The sound of boots in the corridor, the fortress lurching into emergency response, and all of it distant, because Elyria's face had done something complicated. The walls going up and then something getting in the way of the walls, some old pressure cracking through. "Everything," she said. "It contains everything, every transaction, every name, every lord and general and merchant who paid for what happened to my family. 8 years of evidence that my mother kept because she was smarter than all of them, and she knew. She knew they would come eventually, and she wanted to make sure that if they managed to destroy us, the evidence of what they'd done would survive them." Her jaw was tight. "She hid it before the attack. I was the only one she told. You knew where it was." "I've always known where it was." "And you've never gone for it." "I was in chains," she said flatly, and the flatness of it carried 8 years of things she wasn't going to perform for him, for most of the time since then. "And when I wasn't in chains, I was being watched. And when I wasn't being watched, I was too broken to travel 40 miles across open country alone, let alone 700 miles north." She paused. "Until 3 weeks ago. You escaped." "I killed the man guarding me and I walked out," she said. "And I walked north. For 3 weeks. With nothing." She glanced at her arms, at the silver scarring visible below the healer's dressings. "They caught me twice. Let me keep going the second time because they thought the burns were enough. That I'd stop on my own." Something moved behind her eyes. "I don't stop." He believed that completely. "The location," he said. "I'm not giving you that." "Elyria." "I don't know you," she said, and her voice had the quality of a knife. Not angry, not afraid, just precise. "I don't know what you'll do with it. I don't know if you're another man who uses information as a leash. I've had enough men hold a leash on me to last several lifetimes, including kings. My uncle just sent 4 men through a stone wall to kill you in my fortress," Vaelor said. "In my fortress. Which means he has assets I don't know about inside my own house. and he has motivation to keep that ledger from surfacing, and right now you are the primary threat to everything he's built in the last decade. He held her gaze. I cannot protect you if I don't know what I'm protecting. She was quiet for a moment, reading him. He let her do it. Why would you protect me at all? She said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, asked with the careful precision of someone who needed to understand the actual terms of a thing before they agreed to anything. He respected that enough to answer it straight. Because what was done to you was done by people inside my empire, he said, and because I do not let debts go unaddressed. He paused. And because of the other thing, which I told you about this morning, which I meant. Her breathing had changed. Barely. A slight deepening, a shift in cadence. She was looking at him with that amber-dark gaze, and something in her had gone very still, the way things go still when they're making a calculation that matters. The northern ruins at Kale's Point, she said quietly. There's a vault in the old watchtower foundation. My mother built it. It doesn't look like a vault. It looks like a collapsed cistern from the outside. The ledger is inside a waterproofed case, iron and seal wax. Vaelor stood. Ren. Ren materialized at his shoulder. Already pulling the northern route maps. If we move a strike team in the next 4 hours, not a strike team, small, fast, no banners. He paused. And we move the convoy south, full guard, full banner display, loud. I want anyone watching this fortress to see the king going south. Ren's eyes moved to Elyria and back. And the real party? Prepares to ride north in 2 hours. My king. Ren's voice dropped. She's in no condition. She doesn't ride north, Vaelor said. She stays here. Locked room, doubled guard. Nobody enters without my direct authorization coded through the duty captain. He looked at Elyria. You'll be safer here than in open country. She was already shaking her head. I'm not staying. You have 3 broken ribs. I'm aware of what I have. You also have a fever that broke 4 hours ago and dressings that need to be changed twice daily or the burns infect. He kept his voice even. You can argue about it, or you can accept that 2 hours of preparation is better used sleeping than fighting with me. You're going for the ledger, she said. My mother's ledger. You think I'm going to sit in a room and wait while... Yes, he said. Because the alternative is you dying of infection in a ditch somewhere between here and Kale's Point, which would be a waste of everything you've survived. He held her gaze. I'll bring it back. You have my word. Something crossed her face, something that might have been the ghost of a laugh if it hadn't been buried under everything else. A king's word, she said. The last king who gave me his word sold me to a man who used silver irons on me for sport. The words sat in the air between them, like something physical. Then I suppose, Vaelor said very quietly, I'll have to be the first one who doesn't. He rode north with 7 men. No banners, no crown. Road clothes and trail horses and enough weapons distributed across the group that anyone looking at them would see mercenaries before they saw royalty, which was exactly the point. The coastal fortress had sent the full royal convoy south with drums and flags and the kind of visible display that made sure every spy on the road had something obvious to report. Vaelor had his hood up and his mind on the note. She remembers too much. The ledger exists. His uncle had known the ledger existed, which meant Maelor had known, for 8 years, that a record of his transactions was out there somewhere, and had been managing that risk the whole time. Had been managing it with the particular confidence of a man who believed the only person who knew the location was out of reach, locked in the Bloodfang King's territory, branded, broken, kept deliberately weak. Then she'd escaped, and Maelor had moved fast. Faster than Vaelor would have expected, which meant the surveillance network his uncle ran was more sophisticated than any of Vaelor's intelligence reports had indicated, which meant there were more assets in more places than he'd known, which meant that the intelligence reports themselves were compromised, or the people compiling them were, or both. He had spent 11 years building an empire on the premise that he knew what was happening inside it. That premise, he was now certain, had a large and specifically shaped hole in it. Ren rode beside him, saying nothing. They had ridden enough miles together that silence between them was not discomfort, but function. Both of them working through the same problem from different angles, letting the miles pass until something useful surfaced. It was Ren who spoke first. "The men she killed," he said, "or the one she put down. That was solid work. Single strike, correct angle. That's not luck." "No." "She's had training. At some point before or during her captivity, someone taught her how to fight effectively in close quarters with improvised tools." A pause. "Which is interesting given the condition the rest of her is in." "She survived 8 years," Vaelor said. "She didn't survive it passively." "No." Ren was quiet for a moment. "The blood test results. Sora told you." "Sora told me. I'm assuming she told you first." A beat. Celestine air. "If that gets out." "It won't. Not until we have the ledger and I've decided what to do with it." "And what are you going to do with it?" Vaelor looked at the road ahead. Gray sky pressing down on the tree line, the smell of cold soil and last night's rain still in the air. "Everything that name entitles her to," he said. "Every acre, every title, every legal claim that was stolen when my uncle facilitated the massacre of her family." He paused. "And then every name in that ledger gets answered for." Ren said nothing for a moment. Then, "Starting with Maelor." "Starting with Maelor." Another silence. Ren's horse shifted and steadied. "He's at the capital, sitting in the east wing of the citadel, in rooms that have been his for 30 years, with staff that are loyal to him, and access to the communications network you built, and the armory you funded." A beat. "He's going to know you've moved north the moment the decoy convoy doesn't produce you at the southern fortress." "I know. He might move before you get back." "I know that too. And you're still going north." "The ledger has to be in my hands before I confront him publicly," Vaelor said. "Without it, it's my word against his, and he has 30 years of relationships in that court to my 11 years of them. He was the one who taught me how this empire works. Half those lords think of him as the real institutional knowledge, and me as the muscle." His voice was even, stripped of emotion by long practice. "I need the evidence. I need every name in that book, and every transaction, and every date, and every signature, and then I can afford to be as public as I want." Ren absorbed that. "You're sure the ledger is what she says it is?" "Yes." "Because you trust her, or because you want to?" Vaelor looked at him sideways. Ren kept his eyes forward. "I'm asking as the man responsible for your physical security, not as anything else." "I trust her," Vaelor said, "not because of what I want, because I've watched her respond to pressure in the last 12 hours, and what she does under pressure is not what liars do. She calculates. She gives information strategically. She argues when she thinks I'm wrong." A beat. "She doesn't perform. She doesn't give me what I want to hear. She told me she wasn't giving me the location in the same breath as telling me why. That's not the behavior of someone running a deception." Ren considered that. "No," he said finally. "It's not." Kael's Point was 6 hours north on horseback under good conditions. The conditions were not good. The road deteriorated past the last way station into a track that was more suggestion than infrastructure, passing through the remains of what had once been a populated stretch of the northern coast before the territorial wars 30 years back had emptied it. The ruins of farmsteads and wayhouses dotted the landscape, roofless and returning slowly to the soil, the kind of emptiness that had its own specific quality. Not wild emptiness, the natural kind, but human-made emptiness, the kind that had memory attached to it. Vaelor kept moving. The watchtower ruins at Kael's Point had been a navigation landmark once, back when this coastline had regular traffic. Now it was a pile of cut stone slowly losing its shape to the clifftop wind, 3 walls still upright, and one collapsed into rubble, the foundation hidden under decades of moss and encroachment. He found the cistern Elyria had described, circular stone cap listing at an angle, the kind of thing a casual observer would read as structural decay. He dropped down from his horse and went to it. The cap moved with leverage. Beneath it, the drop was deeper than it looked. 8 feet, stone walls, and at the bottom, sitting on a shelf cut into the wall rather than the floor, the case, iron-bound, still sealed with wax that had gone hard and brown with age. Still whole. He pulled it up himself. His hands on the iron were steady. He was aware of that, noted it. 11 years of ruling, and what happened inside him in this moment was not the satisfaction of acquiring an asset, not the strategic pleasure of a move well made. It was something older, something that lived below strategy. Whatever was in this case had been the last thing a dead queen had done to try to protect her child. And he was standing here at the end of an 8-year chain of cause and effect, holding it. He put it in his saddlebag. "My king." The voice was not Ren's. He turned. There were 12 of them, which was more than he had expected, and they had come out of the ruins in coordinated silence, which meant they had been waiting and positioned, and that meant someone had moved very fast in the hours since the fortress. They were in unmarked gear, like the 4 who had come through the wall, but these moved differently. More space between them, wider distribution, the kind of formation that accounted for a wolf's speed in close quarters. His 7 men had their weapons out. 12 against 7 was not a fight he was concerned about for himself. He had come out of worse, but the saddlebag had the case in it, and the horses were behind him, and he needed to think about extraction, not just engagement. The man in front was older, thick through the shoulders, and he had a specific kind of stillness that Vaelor recognized as someone who had been fighting a long time. Not one of the Bloodfang's common soldiers. "Lord Maelor sends his regards," the man said. "My uncle," Vaelor said, "is going to regret the expense. Your uncle says you've picked up something that doesn't belong to you." "My uncle says a lot of things that aren't accurate." The man's eyes moved to the saddlebag. "We're not here for you specifically. Give us the case and we leave. His lordship has no interest in escalating against the crown." "His lordship," Vaelor said, "sent 4 men through a stone wall in my fortress 6 hours ago. That ship sailed." A pause. The man recalculated something behind his eyes. "The case," he said. "Last offer." Ren was at his left shoulder. The other 6 spread in a loose line, 12 against 7, and the man in front was good, which meant he'd need to account for that personally rather than distributing attention across the whole group. "Here's a counteroffer," Vaelor said. "Lay down your weapons, give me your employer's current location, and I'll see to it that you're imprisoned rather than dead. That's the entire deal." The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he moved. "Peut-être." It took 11 minutes. One of Vaelor's 7 took a blade across the upper arm. Not fatal, treatable. The older man in front was as good as he looked, and it took longer than it should have before Vaelor got the angle he needed and put him down. After that, the rest collapsed fast, the way fights did when the primary center of gravity was removed. And then there was blood on the stones and his men breathing hard, and 12 opponents in various states that ranged from unconscious to dead. He stood over the one who was still conscious, younger, face down, one arm pinned, and crouched beside him. "Who else knows we're here?" he said. The man said nothing. "I'm going to ask you once more," Vaelor said, "because I need to know if I'm riding back into a fortified position or into an ambush. Either way, I'm riding back. The question is whether you tell me now or I find out the hard way. And if I find out the hard way, I'm going to be significantly less courteous about how I address your employer." A long pause. The man's breathing was shallow. "There's a second team," he said, "at the fortress. They moved when we moved." Vaelor was already standing. He was already at his horse. "Ride," he told Ren. "Fast as they go." They rode. 6 hours had become 5 since they'd left, and he pushed it harder now, the saddlebag's weight a constant reference point at his side in Elyria's face, that flat, precise face saying, "I don't stop." Somewhere in his head driving a particular urgency that had nothing to do with empire or strategy or the ledger in the case. He had given her his word. He had left her in a locked room with doubled guards in a fortress that had already demonstrated it could be breached. The math of that was not comfortable. They were 2 miles out when the smoke became visible above the cliff line, not the black billowing of a structure fire, but the thinner gray of something controlled, something directed, the kind of smoke that meant deliberate and targeted rather than catastrophic. Ren looked at him. Vaelor did not slow down. He hit the fortress gate at a run, and his guards had it open before he reached it. They knew his horse's sound, knew his speed, had clearly been in some kind of heightened state since well before he arrived. The duty captain met him in the inner court, face hard and unreadable, and Vaelor was already swinging down from the saddle. "The woman," he said. "Alive!" the captain said immediately, and Vaelor processed that and the physical response it produced and filed both away. Second team hit the east wall an hour after you departed. 4 men, same configuration as the first group. We held them, lost 1 guard, 2 injured. He paused. She's not in the room, my king. Where? She moved. During the attack. When the breach happened on the east wall, The captain's jaw worked briefly. She took out the guard at her door, from the inside. By the time we secured the east breach, she was gone from the room. Gone to where? We found her in the armory, the captain said. She's been there for the last 40 minutes. My king, she has not hurt anyone. She's just... He stopped, seemed to be choosing words. She's fortified herself in there. She won't come out. She's armed. Vaelor handed his reins to the nearest man and walked. The armory was in the lower level of the main keep, heavy-doored, with the kind of lock that could be secured from either side. He could hear nothing through it, which meant she was either unconscious or very controlled, and given everything he'd seen in the last 12 hours, he'd bet on controlled. He knocked. Silence. It's Vaelor, he said. I have the case. A long pause. Then the sound of something being moved, a brace, by the scrape of it, and the door opened inward. She had a short sword in her right hand. Her dressings on her left arm had come partially loose, the edge of one burn visible, and she was pale in a way that meant she'd been running on nothing for longer than was advisable, but her feet were planted. Her grip on the sword was correct. Not tense, not shaking, just ready. Behind her, the armory was neatly rearranged. She had pulled the heaviest racks in front of the small window, had positioned herself so that the door was the only viable entry point, and she would have the maximum reaction time to anything that came through it. She looked at him, at the saddlebag in his hand. You came back, she said. I said I would. Something moved across her face, there and gone, too fast to name. He held out the saddlebag. She looked at it for a moment, then she reached out and took it, and her hand brushed his, and the mate bond did what it did. That low pull, that recognition, and he watched her feel it, watched her register it in the slight catch of her breath. The fractional stillness before she pulled the bag to her chest. She set the sword aside, opened the bag, looked at the case, the iron binding, the old wax seal, and something happened to her face that he could not look directly at, the way you can't look directly at certain things that belong too fully to someone else. She sealed it herself, Elyria said. Her voice was barely there. Yes. She knew she was going to die. Not a question. When she sealed it, she knew. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make that smaller or more bearable, and he wasn't going to try. She held the case for another moment. Then she looked up. Your uncle tried to kill me twice tonight, she said, in your fortress, using your own people against you. Her jaw set. He's still inside your empire, still sitting in your court, still operating. Yes. Then what are we waiting for? He looked at her, battered, burned, holding 8 years of evidence against the people who had destroyed her world. And the wolf inside him had gone quiet in a way it never went quiet. The steady, purposeful quiet of a predator who has found its direction and does not intend to lose it. We leave at dawn, he said, for the capital. Together. Together. She nodded once. The word had no performance in it, no relief, no softness, just the recognition of a decision made and a course set, the way two people who have both survived a great deal of difficulty recognize each other, across all the distance of everything they haven't said yet. Then I'll need better clothes than this, she said, and someone to redress these burns. And whoever your healer is, tell her I'll need a full assessment before we ride, because I'd rather know what's broken before it becomes a problem on the road. I'll send Sora. And Vaelor. She said his name like she was testing its weight. Something in the way she held herself shifted, not softer, not easier, but more present, more anchored in the immediate rather than braced against the eventual. Thank you for going. He held her gaze for a moment. We're not done yet, he said. No, she said. We're not even started. He turned toward the door. Behind him, he heard the sound of the case being set carefully on a bench, the wax seal being examined with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting 8 years for a single object. He was 3 steps into the corridor when Ren caught up to him, falling in at his shoulder, voice low and immediate. "My king, message came in while you were in the northern ruins. Fast courier, Vaelor's seal." A beat. "He's called an emergency session of the High Council, claiming you've gone absent without notice and that there are concerns about the throne's stability. He's framing it as a welfare inquiry." Ren paused. "He's moving to establish provisional governance authority. If the council votes it through before you reach the capital, he'll have legal cover for everything he does next," Vaelor said, "including moving against her. Officially." Vaelor stopped walking. He stood in the corridor of his own fortress and felt the specific quality of a trap closing, the kind that had been built patiently over years, every piece in place, waiting for one moment of apparent absence to snap shut. "How long do we have?" "The session is called for 3 days from now," Ren said. "Capital is 2 days hard ride." A pause. "He gave you 1 day of margin. On purpose. He wants you to rush. Wants you arriving exhausted and reactive, without time to build your own position before you walk into that room." Vaelor started walking again. "Then we don't rush," he said. "We arrive with everything we need, or we don't arrive at all." He paused. "Send word ahead. Every lord between here and the capital who has ever had reason to distrust Vaelor Draven. I want to know who they are, and I want them notified that the king is returning with evidence regarding a matter of imperial security." His voice was level. Certain. The kind of certain that came from burning every alternative. "Let my uncle wonder what's in the message. Let him spend the next 2 days guessing." Ren absorbed that. "And if he doesn't wait? If he moves before, then we deal with what he does," Vaelor said. "We don't get to choose the ground anymore. We just get to choose how we stand on it." He walked back toward the room he'd given her, back toward the woman with the iron-bound case and 3 broken ribs and a blood claim to a throne that had been stolen in the dark. And what lived in his chest as he walked was not the familiar cold of strategy. It was something that had been locked down for 34 years under the weight of an empire, finally cracking the surface. Something that felt very much like the beginning of war. They rode out before the sun fully cleared the horizon. 7 horses, no banners, the iron-bound case wrapped in oilcloth and stowed in a saddlebag that Vaelor kept on his own horse and did not hand off to anyone. Elyria rode beside him. Sora had redressed the burns at 4th watch, wrapped the ribs tight enough to allow riding, delivered her assessment in the clipped professional language of someone who had learned that kings and their people did not respond well to being told they should stay in bed. Elyria had listened to all of it, and then asked what the maximum sustainable riding pace was with her current injuries and worked backward from there. She sat her horse like someone who had once known how to sit a horse well, and was rebuilding it from muscle memory, her spine straight despite the ribs, her face forward, reading the road with eyes that catalogued rather than observed. Ren rode at Vaelor's other shoulder. Nobody talked much in the first hour. The road south was empty in the early gray, the coastal scrub giving way to the first real trees of the interior, the air losing its salt weight and picking up the cold green smell of the inland forest. Behind them, Kale's Point was already out of sight. Ahead of them, 2 days in a capital city and a council session that was already in motion. Vaelor's mind had been running the problem since before dawn. Vaelor had called the council session 3 days out, which gave 1 day of margin, which Ren had correctly identified as deliberate, a calculated squeeze designed to force reactive movement. The counter to that was to stop treating arrival as the goal and start treating position as the goal. You arrived with your case built, or you arrived to be dismantled by someone who had spent the last 30 years building his own. The Lords Ren had flagged. 7 names with documented friction against Vaelor spanning the last decade, land disputes, and tribute disagreements, and the specific grievances that accumulated between a calculating man and the people who had been on the wrong side of his calculations, had been messaged before they left the fortress. Vaelor didn't know yet who would respond or how fast. He needed at least 4 council votes before he walked into that chamber. He needed the ledger authenticated by an independent hand who could not be discredited. He needed Elyria publicly confirmed as Celestine heir before Vaelor found a way to discredit her blood claim. 3 problems. 2 days. One road. He had worked with worse odds. By midday, they had covered 30 miles and stopped at a way station, a functioning one, which was increasingly rare in the Northern Territories, a holdover from the trade infrastructure that had existed before the wars. The keeper was a weathered man who asked no questions, which Vaelor had paid for in advance through intermediaries, and the horses got water and grain in a half hour of standing still while the riders ate cold travel food, and Sora checked Elyria's dressings and pronounced them adequate. Elyria sat apart from the main group with her back against the way station wall and her food in her lap, and ate with the focused, systematic efficiency of someone who had spent enough time hungry that eating was not an experience to be wasted on conversation. Vaelor sat beside her. She glanced at him, said nothing. "The council members I've reached out to," he said. "I need to know if any of the names in the ledger overlap with the High Council." She was quiet for a moment, then, 2, possibly 3. "Which?" "Lord Casvin, Lord Aldrich Morn, distant relation to the coastal fortress, not a pleasant man." A pause. "Possibly Senec. I'm not certain about Senec. My mother's notes were thorough, but some of the associations were inferred rather than documented." Casvin and Aldrich Morn, both senior council members. Both men Vaelor had sat across tables from dozens of times, men whose faces he could reconstruct from memory, their habits of expression, their patterns in debate, the specific way each of them had looked at him over the years with what he had read as loyalty. The ground kept shifting under that reading. "When we get to the capital," he said, "the ledger cannot go into the citadel, not immediately, not until I know which rooms are clean." "Agreed. There's a secure location outside the walls. Belonged to my mother. Vaelor doesn't have access." She looked at him then. Something in the mention of his mother. She didn't push on it, but she filed it. He could see her filing it. "All right," she said. "I need to ask you something." "Ask?" "When we go before the council," he said, "when you stand there with a blood test and a ledger and 8 years of evidence, they're going to come at you with everything. Your time in Bloodfang captivity, your mental state, your capacity to recall events accurately after sustained trauma. They will use everything that was done to you as evidence against your credibility. They will try to make the abuse the argument." He kept his voice even. "I need to know if you can hold in that room." Her jaw was tight. "You're asking if I'll break." "I'm asking if you've thought about it." "I've thought about it," she said. "Every day for 8 years I've thought about standing in a room and saying what I know and being disbelieved. Every day." She looked at the tree line. "I've had more time to prepare for that room than anyone in it has had to prepare against me." A beat. "I won't break." He believed her. He stood and went back to the horses, and they rode. The second day's trouble started at a crossroads 18 miles from the capital. Ren saw it first. The stopped rider, the specific quality of stillness that meant waiting rather than resting, and his hand moved and the group slowed before Vaelor had consciously processed the signal. The rider was alone, which could mean anything, and wore the livery of a Capitol House messenger, which narrowed it. He came forward with his hands open and visible, which was either genuine or very well performed, and Vaelor let him approach. "Urgent message for the king," the rider said, "from Lady Sarah Vine. She said to find you on this road." Sarah Vine. Vaelor knew that name, knew the face attached to it, the sharp-boned older woman who had served on the High Council as the voice of the Eastern Merchant Territories for 14 years, who had been a thorn in Maelor's side for most of them, who had never been on Vaelor's list of problems because she had always been on Maelor's list first. He took the message. Ren was at his shoulder, reading it simultaneously. "They know she's with you." Casvin moved a motion this morning to preemptively invalidate any blood claim presented by a former Bloodfang captive on grounds of documented psychological compromise. It passed 6-4. "They're not waiting for the session. Come to my house, not the citadel. Ground floor is watched. Come in through the garden wall. Come tonight, 6-4. 6-4 meant that the 4 lords he had contacted with his advance message had voted against it, which meant the messages had arrived and had done their work, which was the good news. It also meant that 6 council members had voted with Vaelor on a motion designed specifically to neutralize Elyria before she could speak, which meant that the number of names in her mother's ledger was likely larger than Vaelor had assumed, or the fear of those names becoming public was enough to align people who weren't directly implicated. Fear was its own kind of alliance. He handed the message to Elyria. She read it. Her face did not change in any way he could measure. She folded it and handed it back. "They voted this morning," she said, "before we arrived. They didn't wait to see what we had. No. That means they know about the ledger." "It means Maelor told them about the ledger," Vaelor said, "or told them enough. A blood claim from a Bloodfang captive is manageable politically. A blood claim from a Bloodfang captive backed by an authenticated ledger with their names on it is not. So they moved to remove my ability to speak before I could speak." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The road was empty in both directions. Wind moved through the trees. "This motion," she said, "what does it actually do?" "It establishes a legal presumption that any testimony from someone with a documented history of sustained captivity and trauma is inadmissible without independent corroboration from two witnesses of noble rank." He paused. "It's dressed in the language of protecting vulnerable individuals from being exploited in legal proceedings. It has been used twice before, both times to silence inconvenient accusations against powerful men." She looked at him. "And the ledger? The ledger is a physical document. It doesn't testify. It can be authenticated independently." He held her gaze. "The motion is designed to isolate you from the ledger, to make you the vessel for the claim and then disqualify the vessel so that the ledger becomes a piece of evidence without a claimant." The specific quality of the anger that crossed her face then had no heat in it. It was cold, precise, the kind of anger that had been filtered through years of helplessness into something structural, no longer a feeling exactly, but a framework for action. "How do we stop it?" "We get to Sarah Vine tonight," he said, "and we find out what she knows and what she's willing to do." He held her gaze. "And then we move faster than they expect." Chat. Lady Sarah Vine's house was inside the capital walls, but outside the central district, close enough to the citadel to be useful, and far enough from it to have its own gravity. They came in through the garden wall as instructed. In full dark, the horses left outside the city with two of Wren's men. Sarah Vine met them herself in the garden. No staff present. She was older up close than Vaelor remembered, or she had aged faster than the last time he'd seen her. The lines around her mouth deeper, the careful stillness of someone who had been watching something terrible build for a long time and had been waiting for the moment to act. She looked at Vaelor. Then she looked at Elyria, and something moved in her face. Recognition. Not of a person she knew, but of a reality she had been told about and was now confronting. "Celestine eyes," she said quietly. "Your mother had eyes like that. I met her once, at a trade summit before—" She stopped. "Before." Elyria said nothing. "We need to talk about what happens tomorrow," Vaelor said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Come inside." The front room was lit by 2 lamps, the windows shuttered. Sarah had documents on the table, council records, procedural texts, the kind of groundwork that meant she had been preparing for this conversation for some time. "The motion this morning is the visible move," she said, sitting. "The move underneath it is that Maelor has spent the last 2 days meeting individually with council members, not in groups, one at a time, privately." She looked at Vaelor. "The men he's meeting with are coming out of those meetings looking the way men look when someone has demonstrated exactly how much he knows about them." "Leverage," Vaelor said. "Old leverage, accumulated over years. Things he knows and has never used, kept in reserve." She paused. "He's spending it now. All of it. Which tells you something about how seriously he takes this threat." "It tells me he's afraid," Vaelor said. "He should be," Elyria said. It was the first thing she'd said since entering the house, and she said it without emphasis, like a fact. "The ledger authentication," Vaelor said. "Who can do it credibly? Who can't be pressured and can't be discredited?" "Archivist Holin," Sarah said immediately. "She's independent of the council by charter, and Maelor has tried to discredit her twice in the last 5 years, and failed both times. She has standing." "Can she be contacted tonight?" "I already sent a message." Vaelor looked at her. "You started this before we arrived." "I started this 3 days ago," Sarah said, "when the Bloodfang supply convoy documents reached the capital, and I saw what was in them before Maelor's people could intercept the full set." She held his gaze. My king, I have been waiting for someone to pick up this particular thread for 8 years. I was beginning to think no one was going to. A silence settled in the room. Elyria was looking at the council documents on the table. Her hands were flat on the wood surface beside them, and Vaelor could see the burns on her forearms where the dressings ended. The gray-white of silver scarring, the map of everything that had been done to buy these 8 years of Maelor's safety. There's something you need to know, Sarah said, and her voice had changed. Flatter, more careful. About tomorrow. About what Vaelor has arranged. Tell me, Vaelor said. He's invited a guest to the council session. She paused. As a witness to his words, stability concerns regarding the throne. What guest? King Draven Vorn, she said. The name dropped into the room and sat there. Ren went very still beside Vaelor. Elyria's hands on the table did not move, but something in her shoulders changed. A tightening, a pulling inward, the involuntary physical response of a body that recognized a threat before the mind had finished processing the word. King Draven Vorn, the Bloodfang King. He's inside the capital, Vaelor said. He arrived yesterday, Sarah said, under a diplomatic protection flag that Vaelor extended in his capacity as, and this is the part that matters, acting provisional authority, which the council ratified this morning alongside the testimony motion. Her voice was steady, deliberate. Vaelor extended diplomatic protection to the Bloodfang King, which means that inside the capital walls, King Vorn cannot be touched without triggering an international incident that would fracture 3 of your eastern alliances. The silence had a different quality now. Vaelor understood, in the way he understood things that had multiple layers and needed to be held still to be fully seen, what had just happened. Vaelor had not just called a council session. He had constructed an arrival point, a room where Vaelor would walk in with a blood claim and a ledger and a woman who had escaped from the Bloodfang King, and sitting across the table would be the man she had escaped from, protected by a diplomatic flag that Vaelor's own council had ratified, immune to any direct action, present as a witness and a message simultaneously. The message being, she belongs to me, and your own empire has just agreed. If Vorn is in that room, Vaelor said, and Elyria walks in, he will invoke the captive return clause of the Bloodfang Territorial Treaty, Sarah said quietly, which your empire signed 11 years ago, before you understood the full scope of who Vaelor was dealing with. The clause covers escaped branded captives. It is legally binding. She paused. He will ask for her return in front of the full council, under a treaty your empire signed, and Vaelor will second the request. And the 6 council members who voted with him this morning, Ren said. We'll have the legal framework to support it, Sarah said. Elyria had not moved. She was looking at the table, at nothing, with the specific quality of stillness that Vaelor had come to understand was not absence but the opposite. Full presence, everything pulled inward and processing at a speed that didn't show on the surface. Elyria, he said. She looked up. This doesn't change. Don't, she said. Her voice was quiet, precise. Don't tell me it doesn't change anything. It changes everything. You know it does. She held his gaze, and what was in her eyes was not fear. He had looked for fear and found something harder, something that had been tempered by 8 years into a substance he did not have a clean name for. He'll be in that room, with diplomatic protection, and I'll be the woman with a Bloodfang brand on her neck who has no noble witnesses to corroborate her testimony, in front of a council that already voted to invalidate everything I say. The ledger needs authentication that takes time, she said. Time we don't have. Time he is counting on us not having. She looked at Vaelor, and her voice had the quality of someone who had run the math and was not pretending the result was different from what it was. This was always the plan, not just to stop us, to give him a legal mechanism to take me back. Vaelor didn't just protect himself tonight, he arranged a delivery. The word landed like something physical. Vaelor's wolf had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that was not peace. I won't let that happen, he said. You might not have a choice, she said, if you break the treaty. I built this empire, he said. I know what I can afford to break and what the cost is. The Eastern alliances are leverage I can replace, he said, and the certainty in his voice was not performed, not calculated in the moment. It came from somewhere below calculation, from the place where certain things were simply not negotiable, and all the strategy in the world was just the path to protecting them. Listen to me. You are not going back. That is not a variable in any version of this. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then we need a different approach to tomorrow, she said. Something that doesn't require me to walk into that room and stand there while a council votes on what I am. Agreed, Vaelor said. I have an idea, Sarah said quietly. Both of them looked at her. The session is convened under emergency provisions, Sarah said, which means it requires a quorum of 7 council members to conduct binding business. Currently, there are 10 members. 6 voted with Vaelor this morning. She paused. If 4 members refuse to attend the session, there is no quorum. There is no legally binding vote. There is no mechanism to invoke the treaty clause in an official capacity. She looked at Vaelor. The 4 members who voted against the motion this morning are the lords you contacted. I have spoken to 2 of them tonight. They are persuadable, given the right information about what the ledger contains. Give them the information, Vaelor said. I need your authorization to share specific names from the ledger, specific transactions. She paused. Names that will tell them that the men beside them on the council have been operating against this empire's interests for a decade. Names that will make very clear that the session tomorrow is not about throne stability. It's about covering a crime. Do it, Vaelor said. Sarah nodded and stood. There's one more thing, Ren said from the corner, and his voice had the particular quality it had when he was delivering news he had been holding. Everyone looked at him. I received a message at the gate when we came through, he said, from an asset inside the citadel. Vaelor moved this afternoon. He looked at Vaelor. He's not waiting for the council session. He sent a message to King Vorn this evening. The message contained your route, our estimated arrival time. A beat. And the location of the house we're in right now. Sarah went very still. He has someone in your network, Elyria said to Vaelor. Yes, Vaelor said. Someone close enough to know our route and our contacts. Yes. She looked at him. He could see her doing it, the same calculation he was doing, the same inventory of everyone who had known both pieces of information, working backward through the chain of access to the single point where the 2 lines converged. There were only 4 people who had known both the route and the contact with Sarah Vine. Vaelor, Ren, Sora, and the duty captain at the coastal fortress who had coordinated the advance messages. The duty captain who had been in the fortress since before Vaelor's rule, who had been assigned to that posting by the previous administration, who had been, now that Vaelor turned the stone over completely and looked at what was underneath it, recommended for the Coastal Fortress Command 12 years ago by Lord Vaelor Draven. He heard Elyria say his name. He heard it from a distance, through the specific numbness that fell over everything when a man who had spent 11 years believing he knew his house discovered the shape of the hole in it. Then a sound from outside, not loud, not dramatic, just the particular quality of movement in the garden that meant more than one person, and coordinated. Ren's blade was out. The lamp on the table guttered, and through the shuttered window came the voice of a man Vaelor had never heard before, carrying the flat declarative certainty of someone reading a legal instrument. By the authority of the Provisional Council and the terms of the Bloodfang Territorial Treaty, the branded captive Elyria Vael is hereby remanded to the custody of King Dravenmoor. Any interference constitutes a violation of imperial treaty law. Surrender the captive or be held in contempt of the council's emergency authority. The room was silent. Illyria's eyes found Vaelor's. There was no fear in them. There was something harder than fear. The look of someone who had known, at some level, that this moment was coming, who had been building toward it and away from it simultaneously for 8 years, and who was now here at the edge of it and was not going to flinch. But she was also looking at him with something underneath the hardness that he recognized as a question. Not what do we do? Not can you stop this? Just, are you still what you said you were? He looked at her. He looked at the door. He looked at the garden beyond the shuttered window where men with legal authority and a king's mandate had come to take her back in chains. And Vaelor Draven, who had built an empire on control and calculation and the cold understanding that some costs were worth paying, felt 11 years of careful structure crack down the middle. Some things were not negotiable. He looked at Ren. "We're not surrendering anyone," he said. Ren's face set. "My king," he said quietly, "if we fight our way out of this, you break the treaty. You break the Council's provisional authority. By morning, you'll be operating outside imperial law." "I know," Vaelor said. "That's not a king. That's a man with an army." "I know what it is," Vaelor said. "Do it anyway." The shutter came off its hinges when Ren hit it. Not kicked, shouldered, the full weight of a man who had spent 12 years making exits where there weren't any, and the garden beyond was dark, and there were shapes in the dark, and Ren went into them without slowing. Vaelor was 2 steps behind with Elyria's wrist in his hand, not gripping, not dragging, just contact, just the physical certainty of her location while his eyes were already working the space. 4 men in the garden, 2 at the gate, 2 flanking the path. The 2 at the gate had the legal instrument, the parchment, and the seal, the mechanism of authority that made what was happening a lawful action rather than an abduction. The distinction mattered to the men holding it. It did not matter to Vaelor. He put the first flanking man down before the man had finished his sentence. The second came at him from the left, and he took the hit across the shoulder because the angle was wrong for a clean block and the impact drove him into the garden wall hard enough to jar his teeth, but it also brought the man close enough for the short work, and Vaelor did the short work and the man went down. Ren had the gatemen occupied. Vaelor moved through. The street outside Saravine's house was not empty. He had expected that. 5 men on horses, holding the outer perimeter, all of them in the kind of neutral gear that meant they were Vorn's people rather than Mylor's. The Bloodfang King's personal detail, larger men, the specific build of wolves who had been selected and trained for violence rather than drafted into it. 3 seconds to assess. 3 seconds where his mind ran the geometry of street width and angle of approach, and the horses as obstacles rather than assets, and the distance to the nearest dark alley. And underneath the geometry, very quiet, the understanding that this was not a fight he would win cleanly in open street with 1 functional guard and a woman with broken ribs. "This way!" Sarah's voice from behind him, from the garden doorway she had appeared in without announcement. She was pointing left, down a service alley that ran behind the row of houses, barely wide enough for 2 people abreast. No time to evaluate the offer. He moved. Elyria was already moving, ahead of him, which meant she had mapped the alley from the garden even before the shutter came down, because that was who she was. Already mapping, already calculating, 3 steps ahead of every moment, because 3 steps ahead was how you survived when the world had spent 8 years trying to end you. He filed that away and ran. Sara knew her own district. The alley connected to a secondary lane. The secondary lane to a market square that was empty at this hour. The market square to a stable yard where 2 horses were already saddled, which meant Sara had done this preparation before they arrived, which meant the woman had been more ready for tonight than she had indicated, and Vaelor made a note to have a longer conversation with her when time allowed. Ren came through 30 seconds after them, bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, moving clean. 3 of their perimeter riders are already repositioning, he said. They'll have the main routes covered in 4 minutes. The Citadel, Vaelor said. Ren looked at him. My king, not to enter, to draw them. He was already at the first horse. If Vorn's men are chasing us toward the Citadel, they're not watching the western approach. Sarah, can you get the ledger case to Archivist Holland tonight? Right now. Sarah had the case in her hands. She had taken it from the house during the fight without being asked, which confirmed Vaelor's revised assessment of her entirely. Yes, she said. Holland starts authentication tonight, whatever she can establish before dawn. Understood. And I need one more thing. He looked at her directly. The 4 lords, the ones who voted against Maelor's motion. I need their physical presence at the Citadel by dawn. Not messages, bodies. In the building. Sarah's mouth pressed thin. That's a large ask in the middle of the night. I know what it is. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and disappeared back into the dark of the alley. Vaelor swung up onto the horse. Elyria was already on the second one, her face tight with the effort of mounting on broken ribs, her hands on the reins with the practiced grip of someone whose body remembered horsemanship even when everything else was stripped away. She looked at him. The Citadel, she said. The Citadel, he confirmed. That's walking into the center of everything Vaelor controls. Yes. He'll have the hall locked down, his people on every approach. Probably. Then why? Because it's my citadel, Vaelor said, and he said it the way he said things that were not arguments, just facts. And I'm done letting other people operate inside my house. He rode down. The Obsidian Citadel rose out of the capital's center like it had grown there rather than been built. Black stone, the volcanic rock of the northern quarries that his grandfather had hauled south at enormous cost because the statement mattered, because a seat of power needed to look like a seat of power. It dominated the city's skyline in a way that was not subtle and had never tried to be. Vaelor had grown up inside those walls and known them for what they were. Not home, exactly, but the physical manifestation of a thing he had chosen to carry. He came at it from the east, which was where Vaelor would expect him. He did not go to the east. There was an entrance on the northern face that had been sealed for 20 years, since a flooding event in his father's time had compromised the lower corridor, sealed on paper. Vaelor had reopened it 6 years ago as a private contingency and told exactly 3 people, none of whom were Vaelor, none of whom were the duty captain at the coastal fortress. The seal came off with the specific key he had kept on his person for 6 years and never used until tonight. The lower corridor was cold and smelled of old water damage and disuse, and it was absolutely dark until Ren produced a torch from the pack he had somehow kept through the garden fight and the run and the ride, because Ren was exactly the kind of man who kept his torch through all of that, and they moved through the citadel's underbelly by its light. Elyria said nothing, moved close behind Vaelor, one hand occasionally touching the wall for orientation in the narrow passages, breathing in the controlled, measured way of someone managing pain with deliberate attention. He could feel the mate bond as a pressure in his chest, not urgent now, not the yanking hook of 2 nights ago on the cliff road, but something steady and directional, like a compass that had stopped spinning. He was aware of her in the dark in a way that had nothing to do with sound or sight, and everything to do with that deep animal recognition that had stopped being alarming and had become, in the span of 48 hours, simply a fact of his internal landscape. He had not chosen it. He was not going to waste time resisting it. He was going to use everything he had to make sure there was a future in which both of them were alive and intact, and had the luxury of sitting still long enough to understand what it meant. First things first. The lower corridor opened into a servants' passage that ran the full length of the citadel's eastern wing, and the servants' passage opened 200 yards into a storage room adjacent to the council antechamber. He stopped at the door, listened. Voices beyond the wall. Not the anteroom, further, in the main hall, which meant the council had not waited for morning. They were already assembled at, he calculated, 3 hours past midnight, which meant Vaelor had called an emergency night session the moment his garden team had reported contact. Speed. His uncle had always understood speed. Had taught Vaelor, in fact, in the years when Vaelor had been young enough to receive teaching without questioning the teacher, the principle that in a political crisis, the side that controlled the room controlled the outcome. And controlling the room meant arriving first. Vaelor was already in the room. He had invited a guest. Ren, Vaelor said, very quietly. My king. How many of our 7 guards do we have in this building right now? Ren's jaw worked. 4, maybe 4. The night rotation for the royal chambers. The other 3 are still outside the walls with the horses. Get the 4, quietly. Bring them to the anteroom. Ren moved. Vaelor looked at Elyria in the torchlight. She was looking back at him with that steady amber gaze, the one that had been reading him since the first morning when she had woken in his room and catalogued every exit and made the decision about whether he was a threat. She had been making that assessment continuously, he understood, the whole time. A running evaluation of whether he would hold, whether the word he had given was the kind that held under pressure or the kind that dissolved the moment the price became real. Tonight was the price. You don't have to go in that room, he said. Yes, I do, she said. Elyria. He's in there, she said. Vorn is in there, sitting in a chair in your council hall under your roof, protected by your treaties, waiting for someone to hand me to him. Her voice was absolutely level. Not brave, Beyond brave, something that had been on the other side of fear long enough that it had stopped registering the same way. I have spent 8 years imagining the moment I could stand somewhere and say what I know and not be silenced. I'm not staying in a corridor while that moment happens without me. He looked at her for a long moment. Stay behind me until I've established the ground, he said. When I say your name, you walk forward, not before. Agreed. If it goes wrong, it won't, she said. And it wasn't certainty exactly, but the decision to operate as if certainty was available, which was a different and more durable thing. He turned to the door. Amdites. The council hall of the Obsidian Citadel was built for authority. High ceiling, black stone, the long table of pale granite that had been in the room since his grandfather's time, 14 chairs around it, and at the far end, elevated on a single step, the throne chair that no one sat in during council sessions because it was the king's chair, and the king sat there only when rendering final judgment. Vaelor was standing when Vaelor walked in. That detail registered first. Not seated. Standing at the far end of the table, to the right of the throne chair, in the position of a man who had arranged this room and was comfortable in it, who had been here long enough to have the posture of ownership. 7 council members in their chairs. 2 empty chairs, which meant 2 of the 4 lords were already absent, which meant Sarah's work was already partially done. And at the table, in a chair that should not have been there, that had been brought in and placed with deliberate statement, King Dravenmoor. Vaelor had never met him in person. Had intelligence reports, had portraits, had the accounts of border commanders who had dealt with Bloodfang forces. None of it had been inaccurate. Vorn was large, broad through the chest, with the particular stillness of a predator that had never learned to be nervous in any room it entered. Dark hair, close cut, the Bloodfang sigil on a chain at his throat, eyes that moved to the door the moment it opened and stayed there. Not scanning, not assessing, just locked, with the absolute attention of a man who had come here for one specific thing and had no interest in anything else in the room. His eyes went past Vaelor, looking for her. Vaelor stepped into the room and let the door close behind him, and stood in the silence that had fallen the moment the council members registered who had walked in, and he let them sit in it, because the first 30 seconds of any room belonged to the person who controlled the silence. My king. Vaelor's voice was smooth, genuinely smooth, the texture of decades of practice, not a wobble in it. We were concerned for your well-being. The session was called in the interest of— Sit down, Vaelor, Vaelor said. A pause. Something moved behind his uncle's eyes, the recalculation of a man who had been expecting reactive and had gotten something else. He did not sit down. The council has legitimate authority under the emergency provisions. The council, Vaelor said, is missing 2 members and therefore lacks quorum for binding votes. Whatever you've done in this room in the last hour has no legal standing. He looked at the seated members. He looked at each face in turn, the way he had learned to do in his first year of ruling, when he'd understood that a room full of powerful people needed to know they were seen individually, not as a group. Every man in this room knows what I know. By morning, every man in this room will know that I have physical documentation of the transactions that funded the massacre at Vael's Crossing 8 years ago. Names, dates, amounts, signatures. He paused. The men whose names are on that documentation should be thinking right now about whether they want to be sitting in this room when it becomes public. 2 of the 7 had gone very still in a way that was different from the others. Vaelor noted them. You have no documentation, Vaelor said. His voice had changed, not cracked, not desperate, but the smoothness compressed into something harder, the social performance stripped back one layer. You have the unsupported claims of a woman of demonstrably compromised mental state who escaped Bloodfang captivity and constructed a narrative to— Her name, Vaelor said, is Elyria Vael. He looked at the door behind him. Elyria, he said. She came in. She came in with the particular quality of someone who had been waiting their whole life for a room and had decided in the corridor exactly how they were going to occupy it. No performance, no theater, just the way she walked. Straight, the broken ribs costing her in breath but not in bearing, the silver burns visible on her forearms where the dressings showed below her sleeves, the Bloodfang branding on her neck uncovered and unapologetic, and her eyes moving across the room and landing on Vorn and staying there for exactly 3 seconds before moving to Vaelor. She looked at Vaelor the way you look at something you have been building toward for 8 years. Vorn stood up. He was faster than Vaelor had expected. Off his chair and around the table end before anyone else in the room had fully processed the movement, and Vaelor was already in his path between Vorn and Elyria, with 3 feet of floor between them and the bond in his chest gone from compass to wildfire in the space of a single heartbeat. "She carries my mark," Vorn said. His voice was deep, accented, carrying the specific register of a man who had never in his life been told he couldn't have something. "Under the treaty." "There is no treaty," Vaelor said. The treaty was signed under false documentation. The territorial concessions that were traded for the signature were acquired through the facilitation of a massacre of a legitimate royal bloodline. He held Vorn's gaze. The signatory on the imperial side was not authorized to make those concessions. The treaty is void. "That is a claim without legal adjudication," Vaelor said sharply from across the room. "The adjudication is in process," Vaelor said. "The documentation is being authenticated as of tonight by archivist Holin. The process takes however long it takes. Until it concludes, the treaty's validity is in formal dispute, which under imperial law suspends all obligations thereunder." He looked at Vorn. "Which means the captive return clause is suspended. Which means the woman behind me is under my protection and not subject to any claim you hold." Vorn looked at him. The look had many layers. At the top was the political calculation. The assessment of whether Vaelor would hold on this, whether it was position or actual commitment. Underneath that was something older, something that recognized the mate bond resonance even across a room and understood what it meant for the man in front of him and what that man would do. "She belongs to me," Vorn said. It was not political. It was an older language than politics, set in the register of a man who was not negotiating. "She belongs to herself," Vaelor said, and the temperature in the room dropped. What happened next happened fast. Vorn moved and Vaelor met him, and they went into the table hard enough to crack the granite edge, and the council chamber erupted. Chairs scraping, men on their feet, Ran coming through the door with 4 guards and voices shouting legal language that nobody was listening to anymore because the room had passed the point where legal language had jurisdiction. Vaelor had weight and training and 11 years of keeping himself sharp, because an empire required a king who could function in a crisis with his hands as readily as with his words. Vorn had size and pure animal force, and the specific viciousness of a man who had spent decades taking what he wanted from people who couldn't stop him. They were evenly matched in a way that was going to be expensive. The first exchange cost Vaelor 2 impacts, one across the jaw that he rolled with, and one to his ribs that he did not roll with, and that produced a whiteout spike of pain across his right side. He gave back a strike to Vorn's throat that connected partially and created space, and he used the space to get his feet back under him. Around them, the room was in controlled chaos. Ren and the 4 guards holding the perimeter, Vaelor shouting something from the far end of the table, 2 of the council members trying to leave and being very politely prevented. Vaelor kept his attention on Vorn. This was the thing about fighting men like Vorn, men who had never seriously lost, who had spent their whole lives on top of every room they entered. Their technique was excellent. Their conditioning was real. What they lacked was the specific adaptation that came from being beaten, from being in a position of genuine disadvantage and finding a way through it anyway. They had never had to find that. They had always had enough to win clean. Vaelor had been 17 when he had lost his first real fight and learned on a cold floor with blood in his mouth that getting up was a choice you made in the body before the mind was ready, and that making it fast enough to keep fighting was a skill you could build, but only from the raw material of having been down. He was down now, in the way that mattered, out of legal ground, out of institutional cover, the treaty void but not yet adjudicated, the ledger authenticated but not yet public, his council fractured, his uncle across the room with 7 years of arranged pieces in play. He got up anyway. Third exchange. Fourth. The room was taking damage. One of the high-backed chairs in splinters, a lamp down, and the oil spreading across the stone floor, the particular smell of a fight that had gone past sparring into the territory where people made decisions they wouldn't make anywhere else. Vorn caught him across the right temple. The whiteout was longer this time. 2 seconds? 3? The floor under him and the cold stone against his cheek and the sound of the room coming back in waves. His wolf was at full surface now, not the background noise, but the full presence, and what the wolf felt was Elyria's voice. Not the words, not the content, just her voice. Somewhere in the room, saying something sharp and directed. He got up. Vorn was looking at him with the particular expression of a man who had expected him to stay down. The expression of a man recalibrating. "You can't win this," Vorn said. "Not cruelty. Assessment. Not tonight. Not in this room. Your council is compromised. Your treaty is contested. Your documentation isn't authenticated yet." He paused. "Give her to me now, and I walk out of your capital, and you keep your empire." Vaelor wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Vorn, and he looked across the room at Elyria, standing at Ren's left, her face set, the burns on her arms and the brand on her neck, and 8 years of what had been done to her written plainly on her body for anyone in the room to see who chose to look. He thought about what it had cost her to walk into this room, what it had cost her every day for 8 years to keep going when everything had been designed to make stopping feel like the only option. And he thought about the very first morning, the armory, the moment she had opened the door with a sword in her hand and looked at him with that question in her eyes. "Are you still what you said you were?" There was no version of this where he gave her up. There never had been. "No," he said. Vorn's expression shifted. "Then I'll take her," he said. "And when I'm done, I'll burn every stone in this building and every name on your council roster, and I'll do it legally, with the documentation your own empire signed." "The documentation," a voice said from the main door, "that was authenticated 1 hour ago." Everyone in the room turned. Archivist Holland stood in the doorway, small, white-haired, in a traveling coat that meant she had come directly from wherever Sarah had brought her, holding a leather-bound folder with the archivist's red seal on it, and the expression of a woman who had been doing this work for 40 years and was not remotely intimidated by any room she had ever walked into. Beside her, Sarah Vine. Behind them, 2 of the 4 lords, their faces grim, dressed in night clothes over armor, clearly arrived at speed, pushing past the Bloodfang guards at the door who were not Ren's people and were not equipped to stop a senior Imperial archivist with an authentication seal and 4 council members who had just restored quorum. Holland walked to the table, set the folder down, opened it. "The ledger is authenticated as genuine," she said, to the room, to everyone in it, in the flat declarative voice of institutional authority. "The blood match for the Celestine royal lineage is confirmed by independent analysis conducted 3 hours ago. The signatory documentation for the Bloodfang Territorial Treaty has been reviewed and found to contain irregularities consistent with unauthorized execution." She looked up. "The treaty is provisionally void pending full council review. The captive return clause has no current legal standing." The room was absolutely silent. Vorn looked at the folder. He looked at Vaelor. He looked at Elyria. And in that silence, Maelor's composure, 30 years of construction, the smooth, impenetrable surface of a man who had never been caught, cracked. "You have no idea," Maelor said, and his voice had finally lost its evenness, stripped down to something raw and old and ugly underneath. "What it cost to hold this empire together. What your father couldn't manage, and what I built from the pieces he left. Every deal I made, every arrangement, every compromise. This empire exists because of decisions you're too naive to understand. Listen, Lord Vaelor Draven." Vaelor's voice cut through it, not loud, not angry, the kind of level that came from somewhere past anger, from the place where decisions were already made, and what remained was only execution. "You are under arrest for conspiracy in the massacre of the Celestine royal family, for the unauthorized sale of a prisoner to a foreign sovereign, for treason against the Obsidian crown." He paused. "Guards." 2 of the 4 moved. Vaelor looked at him with the face of a man who had believed, until this moment, that he had covered every angle, that the machine he had built was sufficient, that the nephew he had taught to rule would ultimately operate within the boundaries of what was institutionally survivable. He had miscalculated the one variable that didn't follow institutional logic. He had miscalculated her. Vaelor turned from his uncle to Vorn. Vorn had not moved. He was standing at the broken table's edge with his guards flanking him, and the room's geometry shifted entirely from what it had been 60 seconds ago. Authentication on the table, quorum restored, the legal ground under his treaty claim officially contested by the Empire's own archivist. The diplomatic protection flag was still technically in force. Until the provisional authority that had issued it was formally dissolved, Vorn was still, technically, within his rights to be in this room. He was not within his rights to leave with what he'd come for. "Your treaty is void," Vaelor said. "Your protection flag was issued by an authority that is now under arrest. You have no legal standing in this empire as of tonight." He held Vorn's gaze across the granite and the broken furniture and the spreading lamp oil and everything that had been said and done in the last 20 minutes. "Get out of my city." Vorn looked at Elyria one last time. She met his gaze. Straight, unbreaking, the brand on her neck and the burns on her arms and 8 years between them, and she did not look away. Something moved through Vorn's face, not defeat, not concession, something more dangerous. The look of a man who was making a calculation about the future rather than the present, who was deciding that this room was not the final room. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Vaelor said. "It isn't." Vorn moved toward the door. His guards moved with him. 2 of Ren's men fell in as escort, not touching, not threatening, just present, maintaining the geometry of departure. The room watched him go. And then he was gone, and the door was closed, and the council chamber was full of the sound of people breathing. Vaelor turned. Ren was there, solid and blood-streaked, and already thinking about the next 12 problems. Sarah at the table with Holin, reviewing the authenticated documentation with the focused efficiency of people who knew that the legal work was only beginning. The council members, some of them pale, some of them clearly running private calculations about names that might or might not appear in the ledger and what it meant for their futures. Elyria was standing at the edge of the room. She had not moved during the final confrontation with Vorn, had stood there and let it happen and not looked away from any of it. And now she was, he could see it from across the room, shaking. Not her hands, not her face, but somewhere in the center of her, the deep involuntary tremor of a body that had held itself at maximal tension for 48 hours and was now encountering the possibility that it might be allowed to stop. He crossed to her. She looked up at him. Her face was still set, still that controlled, precise expression, but her eyes had gone somewhere complicated. Not soft exactly, but deeper, like something that had been barricaded for a very long time had found a crack in the wall. "Vorn is still out there," she said. "Yes." "He said it wasn't finished." "No, it isn't." He held her gaze. "But tonight he leaves your capital without you. Tonight Vaelor is in chains. Tonight the ledger is authenticated and the treaty is void and your name is on every piece of documentation that was just read into the council record." She looked at the room, at the table with the authentication folder on it, at Vaelor being escorted toward the door by his guards, his face closed and old, at the council members who were not looking at her, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, men who had spent this morning voting to silence her and were now sitting inside the silence of what they'd gotten wrong. "He'll regroup," she said. "He will," Vaelor said. "He'll come back with more men, a larger force. He'll use the treaty dispute as justification, and he'll come across the border." "Elyria." She stopped. He looked at her, at the burns and the brand and the broken ribs and the woman underneath all of it, who had crawled through a storm toward a cliff edge rather than stop, who had crossed 700 miles rather than accept that there was no getting out, who had walked into this room tonight knowing exactly what was waiting for her, and done it anyway. "One thing at a time," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then, for the first time since the cliff road, since the first morning, since any moment of the 48 hours that had rearranged the entire foundation of everything he had thought he knew about his own empire and himself, she let out a breath. Long, slow. The kind that came from somewhere deep, from the place where the body keeps what it can't afford to feel during the crisis. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. It was not softness. It was not safety. She knew better than anyone in this room that they were not safe, that tonight had been a battle and not a victory, that Vorn's face at the door had been the face of someone postponing rather than retreating. But it was real. It was the realest thing he had seen in 2 days, that half inch of breath, and it hit him somewhere below language. From the main door, one of Ren's men came in at a controlled run and went straight to Ren and put his mouth near Ren's ear, and Ren's face did the thing it did when something was bad. He crossed to Vaelor. "Vorn didn't leave the city," Ren said, very quietly. "He went to the west gate. His full force is outside the walls. He had 600 men camped in the hills 2 miles out. Arrived yesterday, same as him." Vaelor went still. "He's not leaving," Ren said. "He's waiting for something." "For what?" Ren's jaw was tight. "We intercepted a signal, sent from inside the citadel 20 minutes ago, before Maelor was arrested." He looked at Vaelor. "Someone sent Vorn a message. 4 words. A beat. The ledger's inside." The room seemed to narrow. He had locked down the access points. He had moved through the sealed corridor. He had swept the variables and the known compromised positions, and he had gotten them here. And somewhere in the machinery of this building, in the staff or the guards or the council members or the walls themselves, there was still a thread he hadn't found. 600 men outside the walls. A message already sent. Elyria was watching his face and reading it the way she read everything. Fast, accurate, with the absolute lack of self-deception of someone who had stopped being surprised by bad news and had built their entire survival strategy around responding to it. "He's coming for the citadel," she said. "Yes," Vaelor said, and the first sound reached them from outside the walls, distant, growing, the low collective thunder of a force in motion, as the Obsidian Citadel, seat of an empire, began to burn. The fire started in the west wing. Not the whole building, not yet, but the specific targeted burn of men who knew which structures to hit first, who had been briefed on the citadel's layout by someone who had spent 30 years inside it. The granary stores below the west corridor went first, then the stables, then the secondary gatehouse, and the smoke came up through the stones in thin threads that thickened fast, and the sound outside the walls had resolved from distant thunder into something organized and directional. 600 men. Vaelor ran the numbers the way he had run numbers in every crisis of the last 11 years. Asset inventory, position, time window, viable outcomes. What he had: 4 guards inside, Ren, Sara, and Holin, who were not fighters, 4 council lords who were politicians, a fractured building, and a woman with 3 broken ribs. What Vorn had: 600 men, a siege formation already in motion, the specific confidence of a commander who had moved on a target with superior numbers enough times to know what the outcome looked like before it started. The numbers did not favor Vaelor. He had been in rooms with bad numbers before. "Ren," he said, "the inner keep, stone doors, iron bar. Get everyone inside. The west wing smoke is going to reach the inner keep in—" "I know. Move." Ren moved. Sara and Holin gathered their documentation. Holin with the authentication folder pressed against her chest like it was the only thing in the room that mattered, which for the purposes of the next hour, it was. The council lords were on their feet, stripped of the political composure that had sustained them through the session, and what was underneath it was just men, some of them old, some of them afraid, all of them operating on the instinct to follow whoever looked like they knew where to go. Vaelor looked like he knew where to go. He went. The inner keep was the oldest part of the citadel, his grandfather's original build, before the expansions, before the west wing and the council hall and all the architecture of administration that had been added over 2 generations. The walls were 4 feet thick, and the doors were a single slab of iron-banded oak that had survived 2 previous sieges and showed the scarring of both. He got everyone inside, got the bar down, and stood in the low-ceilinged room with the smell of old stone and the sound of the fire growing outside, and 12 people he was now responsible for keeping alive. Elyria was beside him. She had not spoken since the word came about Vorn's force, had moved with the group through the corridors with the focused efficiency he had come to recognize as her operational mode. Not absence, not shutdown, but everything unnecessary stripped away and only function remaining. She was pale. The broken ribs were costing her in ways her face wouldn't show, but her breathing would. That careful shallowness of someone managing pain below a threshold they decided was acceptable. "There's a passage," he said to her quietly. She looked at him. "From the inner keep, runs under the east foundation, comes out 200 yards outside the walls, in the old orchard." He paused. I can get everyone out. Sarah and Holin, and the lords and you. And you? She said. After. Her jaw set. No. Elyria, after means never, she said. After means you stay and fight 600 men, and I walk into an orchard and wait to find out if I'm a widow before I've been anything else. She held his gaze. No. Something in his chest tightened. Not the bond, or not only the bond, but something more specific. The recognition of a person who saw the move clearly and refused it not from fear, but from a particular kind of clarity about what mattered more than survival. He had spent 11 years making the cold calculation, trading personal safety for strategic outcome, and he had been right that it worked. He had never before been in a room where someone else was making that calculation on his behalf, putting themselves in the equation without being asked. He didn't have time to sit with what that meant. Then we do it together, he said. Yes, she said, like that was the only answer that had ever been available. But the outer wall breach happened 20 minutes after the siege began. They heard it through the keepstone. Not the sound of the wall exactly, but the change in the fire's voice, the specific quality of wind through a gap that hadn't existed before. And then boots, many of them, on the citadel's outer courtyard. Vaelor had sent the council lords and Sarah and Holin down the passage. Sarah had argued. He had looked at her and said the archivist and the documentation had to survive, and Sarah had understood the logic and hated it, and taken Holin's arm and gone. That left Vaelor and Ren and his 4 guards in Elyria, and Vorn. The inner keep door held for longer than he expected, the iron bar doing what 300 years of smithcraft had designed it to do. And in the time it held, he stood in the low stone room and felt the particular quality of a moment that had stripped itself down to its essential components. No empire, no council, no legal instruments or treaty disputes or authenticated documentation, just the door and the fire's sound and the people behind him and the thing he was willing to do to keep them from what was on the other side. He had spent 34 years building a self that could run an empire. 34 years of controlled temperature, of the cold calculation, of understanding that survival required the willingness to make choices that cost you in ways you couldn't afford to show. He understood now, with the clarity that only came when the architecture of a life was under direct threat, that every year of that construction had been moving toward this room. Not because the Empire mattered less than he'd thought, because it turned out the Empire was not the thing he was most willing to bleed for. The door came down. Vorn came through first, which told Vaelor everything he needed to know about the man. A commander who sent his force through a breach first was a different creature from a commander who entered behind them, and Vaelor had not been certain until this moment which kind Vorn was. Now he knew. He went forward to meet him. The fight in the council hall had been political in its way, staged, witnessed, constrained by the presence of an audience and the geometry of consequence. This was not that. This was 2 men in a stone room with fire at the edges, and the thing between them reduced to its simplest form, and the simplest form was not complicated. Ren and the 4 guards engaged Vorn's men at the breach. The sounds behind Vaelor became something he processed as spatial data, positions, movement, the relative threat levels of each engagement, and kept at the periphery while the center of his attention stayed on Vorn. He was tired. The temple blow from the council hall had left a headache that was going to be significant once he had the time to notice it, and his right side where Vorn had caught his ribs was producing a sustained complaint that spiked into white noise every time he rotated. Vorn was tired too, or something like tired, the particular compression of a man who had moved fast and hard for the last 12 hours and was running on will and the momentum of a siege. Neither of them slowed. Second exchange was faster than the first had been, tighter. Both of them passed the assessment phase and into the territory where the body moved on accumulated knowledge rather than fresh calculation. Vaelor took a hit across the shoulder that torqued him left and used the torque to drive his elbow into Vorn's jaw, and felt the impact go up his arm and into his shoulder and through the right side complaint and out the other side. Vorn staggered. Not down, not finished, but staggered. And in that half second of imbalance, Vaelor heard something. Not sound, exactly, or not only sound. The mate bond, which had been running as background current through everything since the keep door fell, surged, the way it had surged on the cliff road when he'd stopped the convoy, The way it had surged in Sarah's garden when Elyria's name was called in the legal instrument's flat voice, and the quality of it was different from every previous surge. Not alarm. Something vast. He turned his head. He couldn't help it. The wolf in him turned before the man did. Elyria was standing in the center of the room. She had moved away from the wall, away from the guarded position she had held since the door came down. She was standing in the open floor with her arms slightly out from her sides, and her face, the controlled, precise face that had been her armor through everything, had gone somewhere else. Not blank, not frightened. Something he had no precise word for, some state that lived below expression, below the social constructions of how a face was supposed to look when it communicated. Her eyes were closed. The burns on her forearms were... He processed this and then processed it again because his first read didn't match what he was seeing. The burns were luminescent, not bright, not dramatic, but the silver white of the scar tissue had taken on a quality that was not reflected firelight, that had its own source, a cold, clean light that moved up her arms and into her shoulders and spread. The Bloodfang brand on her neck was the same. And then she opened her eyes, and they were not amber and not brown, but white. The clear white of something that had been compressed under 8 years of weight and systematic destruction, and had finally found the pressure point at which it could no longer be contained. The wolf. Not his wolf. Her wolf. The one that had been locked down so long, suppressed by silver and deprivation and the deliberate systematic breaking of someone who needed to be kept small, that even she had not known it was still in there, still whole, waiting in the dark of everything that had been done to her for the single moment when the conditions were finally sufficient. The celestial white wolf. He had read about it. Every scholar in the Obsidian Crown's library had something on the Celestine royal bloodline's specific power. The white wolf that carried a weight of command in its very presence, an old authority that operated not through fear but through something more fundamental, something that reached down into the wolf nature of every creature in range and spoke in a language that predated every empire and every border and every constructed hierarchy. It spoke now, not in words, not in sound, in presence. The Bloodfang soldiers, Vorn's men, trained killers who had broken through an imperial wall without hesitation, stopped. Not tactically, not by choice. They stopped the way a thing stops when the ground beneath it changes its nature, when the framework that had been holding a behavior in place is simply no longer there. One by one, in a wave that moved from the center of the room outward, they went to their knees. Ren's guards stopped fighting because there was nothing to fight. The Bloodfang soldiers were kneeling, all of them, weapons at their sides, faces down, the involuntary submission of wolves encountering an authority their blood recognized before their minds could contest it. The room was silent except for the fire. Vorn had not knelt. He was standing in the center of the room, 3 feet from Vaelor, with the specific, rigid stillness of a man fighting something in his own body. The visible tension of will against the bone-deep compulsion of a wolf nature that was trying to answer a command he had spent a lifetime refusing to answer to anything. He was shaking with it. Vaelor looked at him, looked at the shaking in the broad shoulders, the jaw clamped tight, the hands fisted at his sides. He understood what he was seeing, not weakness, not the failure of strength, but the last-ditch expenditure of a man who had built his entire identity on the premise that he knelt to nothing, and who was now standing in a room where everything that premise was built on was being dissolved by something older and larger than he knew how to fight. Vaelor stepped toward him, not to strike. He was done striking. He looked at Vorn's face, the face of a man he had hated in the abstract for 2 days and now stood in front of as a concrete reality. And what he found inside himself in that moment was not rage. Rage had burned through somewhere in the third fight, somewhere between the council hall and the keep door, and what was left underneath it was something colder and more permanent. "It's over," he said. Vorn looked at him. His eyes were red-rimmed with the effort of standing. The shaking had moved from his shoulders to his hands. "You don't have an empire anymore," Vaelor said. "You have 600 men in a building that is on fire, and every one of them is on his knees. The treaty that protected you tonight doesn't exist. The man who built it for you is in chains." He paused. "And the woman you branded is standing 20 feet from you, and she is the reason your entire force just stopped breathing in your direction." He held Vorn's gaze. "Put down your weapon." A long moment. Vorn's jaw worked, and then, slowly, in the specific way of a man making the most expensive choice of his life, he opened his hand and the blade dropped to the stone floor. His knees hit the floor 3 seconds later. Not combat. Not the swift drop of someone taking cover. The deep, slow kneel of a body that had held its position as long as it could and had finally spent everything it had. The room held that image for a moment that had the quality of something that would be carried for a very long time. The Bloodfang King, on his knees, in the burning hall of an empire he had come to take. The fire was contained before dawn. Vaelor's garrison, fully alerted when the breach happened, had moved with the discipline of soldiers who knew the building and had trained for exactly this kind of interior defense. The West Wing was a loss. 3 rooms, the old granary, a section of corridor. But the main structure held, and by the time the sky began to gray at the eastern edge, the fires were down to smoke and embers, and the citadel was scarred but standing. Vorn was held in the lower cells. His 600 men were disarmed and held in the outer courtyard under garrison guard. The processing of what to do with 600 foreign soldiers who had technically been operating under a diplomatic protection flag that was technically still in legal dispute would require days of careful work, and Vaelor set Sara and the surviving uncompromised council members to the task and turned his attention to the things that couldn't wait. Maelor was in the same cells as Vorn, which Vaelor had arranged deliberately. He had gone down to see his uncle once, in the first hour after the fire was contained, and stood outside the cell door and looked through the iron bars at the man who had taught him how to run an empire. He had thought he would feel something clean, triumph or justice, or the satisfaction of a debt addressed. What he felt instead was the complicated weight of a thing that had many layers. The uncle who had sat across the table from a boy who had just lost his father, and had said, in a voice that had seemed like steadiness then and now, revealed itself as something else entirely, that the empire needed a king, and the king needed to be ready. The 30 years of investment in Vaelor's capability that had always been, underneath, an investment in a mechanism that Maelor controlled. The specific cruelty of being taught to be strong by someone who had calculated that your strength was useful to them. He had not spoken to his uncle through the bars. He had looked at him for a long moment and then turned and walked back up the stairs, carrying the complicated weight, because that was what you did with it. You carried it, and you kept moving, and you didn't let it become an excuse for the next thing you did or a story you told about yourself. The Empire needed decisions. He made them. It was 3 days before the Citadel was fully operational again. 3 days of council sessions and legal proceedings, and the careful documentation that would turn what had happened in the last 48 hours into a political reality that held under scrutiny, not just a king's account of events, but authenticated evidence and witness statements, and the kind of institutional record that made what happened impossible to revise after the fact. Archivist Holin worked without stopping for the first 36 hours. The ledger was entered into the official record. Every name, every transaction, every date and amount and signature read into the permanent documentation of the Empire with Holin's authentication seal and the testimony of the 4 council lords who had been in Sarah's house and had heard what was said. Maelor's network, once the initial names were identified, unraveled with the specific speed of a thing that had been held together by fear rather than loyalty. The people in it who had joined because they believed in the project, and the people who had joined because they were afraid of Maelor chose different calculations when Maelor was no longer in a position to threaten anyone. Vaelor received confessions for 3 consecutive days. He read each one and set it in the record and moved on. Elyria was present for the council session that formally recognized her Celestine blood claim. She sat in the chamber, in a chair at the table, not standing, because the ribs were still broken, and Sora had been very explicit about the limits of what the body could sustain on pride alone. And she listened to Holin read the documentation, and she watched the council members vote, and she did not perform anything. No satisfaction on her face, no relief. No the particular theater that people expected when something long-awaited finally arrived. What was there was something quieter and more internal. The look of a person who has carried a truth for so long that its official confirmation changes something real in the body. A tension that had been structural, load-bearing, finally permitted to release. After the session, she sat alone in the council room for a long time. Vaelor found her there. He sat across the table from her and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the room held them both in the particular silence that had built between them over the last 5 days. Not uncomfortable, not waiting for something, just the silence of two people who had been through a great deal together in a very short time and were now in the first moment that didn't require immediate action. She spoke first. "My mother would have been very precise about this," she said. Her voice was quiet, aimed at the table's surface or at something past it. She was very precise about everything. She had a specific way of sitting in a room where she was uncomfortable, very straight, shoulders back, like the posture itself was the argument. A pause. "I was 13 the last time I saw her. I've been trying to remember her accurately instead of the version of her that I needed." She looked up. "It's harder than it sounds."
"Yes," he said. "You think about your father. More than I used to." He held her gaze. He was not a good king. He was adequate at certain things and inadequate at everything else. And the inadequacy was the kind that made him angry, and anger was his primary tool of governance. I spent a long time understanding that, and then a long time deciding what to do with the understanding. He paused. "I chose to be a different kind of king. I'm still not sure I got it right."
"You got some of it right," she said. "The ledger will tell me how much of it I got wrong," he said. "The names in it include men who operated inside this empire under my rule. Things that happened while I was occupied elsewhere that I should have found sooner." He set that down plainly, without defense. "I'm going to have to account for that. Not to you specifically, to the people it affected." She looked at him with the steady amber gaze. "You didn't know." "No. And that's the thing I'll be sitting with for a long time. How much of what you don't know is ignorance, and how much is a choice you made about where to look?" He paused. "I think I chose, at some level, to trust the structure Vaelor built because examining it carefully would have been slow and uncomfortable, and the Empire had other problems. That's not the same as what he did. But it's not clean either." "No," she said. "It's not." She held his gaze. "I appreciate that you said it without looking for me to tell you it was all right." "It's not all right," he said simply. "It's just true." She was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" she said. "Not the political part. I understand the political part." She paused. "The other part." He looked at her across the granite table that had been cracked in one corner since Vorn had gone into it 3 nights ago, and he thought about the cliff road and the armory and the corridor outside the council hall and every conversation they had been in together where the immediate crisis had made certain things very clear and other things required postponement. "The other part," he said, "is whatever you want it to be. I told you what I know about what I felt on that cliff road. I meant it. I also understand that what I know about it does not constitute a claim on anything you haven't chosen to give." He paused. "You have a blood claim to the Celestine territories. You have legal standing that exists independently of anything that happens between you and me. I want that to be clear." "It's clear," she said. "Then whatever comes after, you make that choice from a position of having choices, not from a position of having been found on a road and brought in from the cold and feeling obligated to—" "Vaelor," she said. He stopped. She was looking at him with something in her face that had moved past the precise, controlled reading he had come to know, and into a territory that was less defended and therefore more costly to sustain. The look of someone setting down a weight they had carried for a long time and finding out what their arms felt like without it. "I know what I feel," she said. "I've known for most of the last 5 days. I was waiting for enough of the emergency to pass that I could trust the feeling was mine and not just the reaction of someone who had been in the dark a long time and grabbed onto the first light that didn't hurt." She paused. "I'm confident now." He held her gaze. "About what?" "About you," she said. "About this." She let out a breath. "I'm not saying it's uncomplicated. I'm saying I know what I feel, and I know the difference between choosing and collapsing into something, and this is choosing." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been an empire's king for 11 years, he said. "I've made decisions that moved armies and reshaped borders, and I have been certain of most of them in the moment, and I've had to live with some of them afterward." He looked at her hands on the table. The healed knuckles, the silver burns at the edge of the dressings, the specific way she held herself that had been forged in conditions no person should have been put through. I have not once in 11 years been as certain of anything as I was on that road in the storm. Her hands turned slightly on the table. An opening. He reached across and covered them with his. Not grip, not possession, just presence, warmth, contact. The physical fact of two people who had been through fire together choosing to sit in the same moment for no strategic reason at all. She looked down at his hands on hers, looked up. The Celestine territories need rebuilding, she said. They've been in administrative limbo for 8 years. The people there, yes, he said. And this empire has structural issues that the ledger is going to expose in ways that require systematic reform, and that's going to take years. Yes, he said. I'm saying we're going to be very busy. I know. And I don't want to build anything else on a foundation that has holes in it that we chose not to look at, she said. Whatever we build, I want to know what's underneath it. That is the only way I know how to build, he said. I've been doing it wrong. I want to do it right. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her hands under his and held them. And what moved through her face was not happiness exactly. Happiness was too light a word for the territory they were in, too clean, not accounting for everything it had cost to get here. What it was real. The particular reality of a thing chosen with full knowledge of what the choosing meant and what it would require and who you were handing that knowledge to. Outside the council hall, the citadel was full of the sound of the work that needed doing. Hammers in the west wing, where the repair had already started, voices in the corridors, the machinery of an empire that had been shaken to its foundation and was beginning, stone by stone, to rebuild. They held the formal recognition ceremony 6 weeks later. Not a coronation. That would come when the legal processes had run their course and the Celestine territorial claims had been formally adjudicated and the documentation was complete. What they held was a public acknowledgement. On the citadel's outer steps, in front of the assembled population of the capital, with the council in attendance and the authentication documents read aloud by Holin in the flat, authoritative voice that stripped the proceedings of all theater and left only the record. Elyria stood on the steps in the pale morning light. She had chosen her own clothes for it. Not ceremonial, not the white and gold that the occasion might have suggested, but gray, the color of the stone she had been found crawling across, the color of the scars on her arms. She had not covered the burns, had not covered the brand on her neck. She had looked at the brands that morning in the mirror, and Vaelor had been in the doorway, and she had said, without turning, "I'm not hiding it. I'm not going to stand in front of those people and pretend I arrived here clean." And he had said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that except the silence of someone who understood completely. She stood on the steps, and the archivist read the words, and the council confirmed the documentation. And the crowd, 1,000 people on the square below, 2,000, the number had grown as word spread that morning, was quiet in the way crowds go quiet when something real is happening and they know it. At the end of the reading, Holin stepped back, and Elyria looked out at the square. She did not perform a speech. She had told Vaelor beforehand that she had not prepared one, that she would say what she meant or say nothing, and she stood in the silence for a long moment, and then she spoke. "I was sold to a man who believed that breaking a person completely was the same as owning them," she said. Her voice was level. It carried. He was wrong about that. What I know now that I didn't know then is that the things he broke were not the most important things. A pause. "I'm not here because I survived. Survival is a floor, not a destination. I'm here because the women and men before me built something worth coming back to, and the people standing with me now chose to be the kind of people who look under the stones even when what they find there is difficult." She looked at the square. "That's the kind of empire I intend to help rebuild. Not the kind that tells you what it is, the kind that shows you." Silence. Then the square answered her. Not the formal applause of ceremony, but the particular sound a crowd makes when it recognizes something true. The specific human response to a person who stands before them without armor and says exactly what they mean. Vaelor stood to her left. He had spent 11 years standing on those steps in various configurations of authority, and he understood for the first time, listening to the square answer her, that what he had been building in all that time was infrastructure. Necessary, real. But infrastructure without something living at the center of it was just stone and process. She was the living thing. Not because she was exceptional, though she was, but because she had been through the specific process that strips everything away and forces a reckoning with what remains. And what had remained in her was not power, not the need for it, not the armor that people who had been powerless often built the moment power became available to them. What had remained was just her, clear-eyed, undefended in the ways that mattered, carrying her damage plainly and without apology. He thought about the cliff road, about the 34 years that had led to the moment he had stopped a royal convoy in a storm on a road above a cliff for no reason he could rationally explain, and the woman he had found in the mud, and the 8 years of what had been done to her, and the 5 days that had followed, and the 6 weeks of careful work that had followed that. He thought about his uncle in the cells below the citadel, about the names in the ledger and the accounting that was still ongoing, and the structural reforms that were going to take years, and the specific ongoing work of building something that did not have the same holes. He thought about what Wren had said in a corridor 5 days ago. That's not a king, that's a man with an army. And the particular accuracy of it. He had stepped outside the law to protect her, and the law had needed to be rebuilt in the aftermath, and he was under no illusion about what that meant, about the precedent it set, and the questions it raised, and the ongoing work of earning back the institutional trust that a man who had broken the law still owed. He was willing to do that work. Not because he had won, not because the outcome had justified the choice in the clean way that outcomes sometimes justified choices in the stories people told about powerful men, but because the choice had been his, and the consequences were his, and carrying both of them honestly was the only version of this that he could live in. The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. He stood on the steps with her in the morning light, and the square slowly emptying below them, and the citadel's sounds behind them, and the rebuilt future somewhere ahead. Not simple, not clean, but real in all the ways that mattered. She turned her head and looked at him. "We have 7 hours of council sessions this afternoon," she said. "Yes." "And the Celestine territorial administrators arrive tomorrow morning." "Yes. And Wren has that list of border security assessments he's been trying to get in front of us for a week." "I know," he said. "I'm just saying," she said. "We're going to be very busy for a very long time." He looked at her profile in the light, the high bones and the amber eyes and the silver burn scars visible at her collar and the brand on her neck, and the particular way she held herself that was not the posture of someone who had escaped a past, but of someone who had folded it into the frame of who they were and carried it forward. "Yes," he said, "we are." She reached over and found his hand without looking, the same way she had across the council table. Not grip, just contact, just the simple physical fact of choosing proximity in a world that had spent a long time making proximity dangerous. He closed his hand around hers. Below them, the capital went on with its mourning. The empire went on with its work. The rebuilding that was not a return to anything that had existed before, because the thing that had existed before had holes in it they had chosen not to examine, but the construction of something new, on a foundation they were examining stone by stone together. The girl who had crawled through a storm on her hands and knees, because stopping had never been an option, stood in the morning light of her own choosing. The king who had stopped a convoy on a cliff road for a reason that no strategy had prepared him for, stood beside her. Neither of them were finished. Neither of them were whole in the way that stories sometimes resolved people into wholeness at the end, as though the events of a life could be processed cleanly and the person come out the other side without the shape of what they'd been through still visible in how they moved. They were still cracked in places, still carrying the weight of the choices made and the choices they hadn't made fast enough, and the years that had cost what they'd cost. But they were standing, and in a world that had tried very hard to ensure they weren't, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything.